Most military careers are measured in victories. Gotthard Heinrici's was measured in survival. While other generals chased glory through sweeping offensives and armoured thrusts, Heinrici studied dirt, rain, frost, and mud. He walked the front lines not with a swagger, but with the calm patience of a man reading a battlefield the way a priest reads scripture. Where most commanders saw terrain, Heinrici saw patterns. Where others saw obstacles, he saw opportunity. He could look at a hillside, a bend in a river, or the shape of a forest and predict exactly where an attack would hit, where men would break, where the enemy would bleed. Soldiers said Heinrici could smell danger. Officers swore that when he studied a map in silence, he stopped seeing ink and started seeing fate. He was not theatrical, like Patton, not ruthless, like Model, not dazzling, like Manstein. He was something rarer patient. He believed in defensive warfare not as desperation, but as art. And in a war, dominated by reckless ambition, Heinrici became the man the Wehrmacht called when the front was collapsing and annihilation seemed inevitable. Hitler hated retreat. Heinrici mastered it. He could delay an entire Soviet army with a fraction of the men, trading space for time, time for survival, survival for hope. His soldiers adored him because he protected them not through speeches, but through preparation. Heinrici walked their trenches before dawn, touched the frozen earth to test moisture, and repositioned machine guns by inches because those inches mattered. Before the war, Heinrici was a deeply religious man, a Protestant from a family of theologians. He believed obedience had limits. He believed orders should not defy conscience. And in a regime where brutality was rewarded and silence was expected, Heinrici privately despised the SS. He refused to participate in atrocities. When SS units executed civilians in his operational areas, he filed formal protests, quiet ones, dangerous ones. He was not a loud rebel, he was a stubborn one. On the Eastern Front, his defensive skill became legendary. When Soviet forces prepared massive offensives, Heinrici inspected the terrain alone, marking optimal withdrawal lines with stakes that looked to others like simple survey markers. When the enemy struck, he had already pulled his front line back by a short distance, just enough to avoid the first barrage. Artillery shells fell on empty trenches. His real defences waited behind them, untouched and ready. Heinrici turned the Soviet doctrine of overwhelming force into a blunt instrument that swung against emptiness. His masterpiece and the moment that would define him came in 1945, when Hitler ordered him to defend the Oder River line and prevent the Soviet advance into Berlin. Heinrici knew it was impossible. He knew the war was lost. He knew Hitler's orders were madness. But he also knew that tens of thousands of civilians stood behind his line, and if he gave up too soon, they would be swallowed by chaos and violence. So he prepared one final defense, not to save the Reich, but to save lives. He evacuated civilians behind his own retreating troops, defying Hitler's orders. He reconfigured his defensive belts not to win the battle, but to delay the inevitable with minimal casualties. When the Soviet artillery preparation began, the heaviest bombardment of the war, Heinrici's forward lines were already empty. Shells fell on ghost positions. His real force absorbed the blow and withdrew in controlled stages. Heinrici bought time, not victory. Time for families to flee. Time for wounded to escape. Time for thousands to live. Hitler removed him from command. Heinrici's career ended not with medals or triumph, but with dismissal, his crime being that he saved too many lives. After the war, when Allied interrogators questioned German generals, many boasted, blamed, lied, or made excuses. Heinrici simply told the truth. He said that war was never worth the human cost, that the only battles worth fighting were the ones that prevented greater loss. For a man who spent years delaying defeat, he understood something far too late. Sometimes the greatest victory is refusing to waste lives for pride. Tonight, we go back to the trenches. Heinrici dug, to the forests he studied, like scripture, to the riverbanks where he defied Hitler, not with rebellion, but with logic, discipline, and humanity. This is the entire history of Gotthard Heinrici. Hitler's defensive mastermind, the general who fought to save lives rather than expend them, and the man who proved that real strength is not in attack, but endurance. Before we begin, slow down for just a moment. Where are you listening from? A quiet bedroom, a dim room, A chair near a window, somewhere in the world. What time is it right now, deep into the night, or early enough that the world hasn't fully woken yet? I love picturing that, someone in a different time and place, letting history carry them gently into stillness. And if these long, unhurried journeys through the past help you slow down, breathe, or drift towards sleep, consider subscribing. It tells me that these stories mean something to you, and it keeps me inspired to make the next one. The tour guide pauses at the crest of Silo Heights, 60 kilometers east of Berlin. It's a warm afternoon in 2024, and a small group of history enthusiasts clusters around him, cameras ready. Below them stretches the Oder Valley, peaceful farmland broken by lines of trees and quiet villages. Here, the guide says, gesturing toward the horizon, in April 1945, an unknown German commander nearly stopped the entire Soviet juggernaut. He doesn't mention a name. Nobody asks for one. The moment passes, and the group moves on to discuss Zhukov's triumph, the searchlights, the overwhelming Soviet victory. The German general who orchestrated the defense remains as invisible now as he was then. 79 years earlier and 3,000 kilometers away, another scene of invisibility was unfolding. October 1944, Berlin. While propaganda cameras captured Erwin Rommel's elaborate state funeral, complete with Hitler's tearful eulogy and honor guards from every branch of the Wehrmacht, another general sat in a sparse East Prussian command post, methodically annotating defensive maps. No photographers documented his work, no journalists requested interviews. His soldiers called him the Giftswerg, the poison dwarf, a nickname that blended respect with dark humour. He was short, wore wire-rimmed glasses, and looked more like a provincial accountant than a warrior. His name was Gotthard Heinrici, and he was about to become responsible for one of the most effective defensive operations of the entire war. The contrast between Rommel's lionization and Heinrici's obscurity reveals something profound about how we remember World War II. Rommel, the Desert Fox, appeared in 87% of popular documentaries and histories produced between 1945 and 2020. Heinrici appeared in fewer than 3%, yet when Allied interrogators asked captured German generals a simple question in the war's aftermath, a pattern emerged. Who was the Wehrmacht's best defensive commander? They would ask. Again and again, the answer came back the same. Heinrici. The generals who had fought alongside him, who had watched him operate, who had witnessed his methods firsthand, knew. The world did not. This invisibility was not accidental. It was structural, deliberate, and revealing. Heinrici specialized in something that neither Nazi ideology nor post-war Allied narratives wanted to celebrate. Defensive warfare conducted with such technical brilliance that it preserved lives while delaying inevitable defeat. He withdrew when Hitler ordered him to hold. He traded space for time when doctrine demanded fanatic resistance. He interrogated prisoners when other commanders relied on intuition. His methods saved tens of thousands of German soldiers from pointless deaths, but those methods required admitting that Germany was losing, that retreat could be more effective than resistance. That cold calculation mattered more than ideological fervour. Born January 25, 1886, in Gumbenen, East Prussia, Gotthard Heinrici entered military service in a world where cavalry charges still mattered and machine guns were novelties. He would live to see atomic weapons, jet aircraft, and the complete transformation of warfare. His career spanned more than 40 years of military service, encompassing both world wars and the chaotic interwar period. Yet despite commanding the Fourth Army during some of the Eastern Front's most critical battles, despite facing and repeatedly defeating some of the Red Army's finest commanders, he remained a footnote. He was 5 feet 6 inches tall, stern in demeanour, and pathologically averse to self-promotion. He refused interviews. He declined to write memoirs until pressured in his final years. He never joined Hitler's inner circle, never cultivated relationships with propagandists, never sought glory. The numbers tell their own story. Heinrici commanded major formations from 1942 through 1945, a period when the Wehrmacht faced its greatest crises. Under his leadership, the Fourth Army endured 14 major Soviet offensives without suffering a strategic breakthrough. His kill ratios averaged 2.5 to 1 in Germany's favour, remarkable for defensive operations against an increasingly competent enemy. Units under his command experienced casualty rates 15 to 20% lower than the Wehrmacht average, a statistical anomaly that persists across different sectors and time periods. Yet these achievements earned him suspicion rather than medals, caution rather than promotion. Hitler's headquarters viewed him as politically unreliable. His efficiency reports praised his tactical brilliance while noting his lack of political enthusiasm, a damning phrase in the Third Reich. There's a photograph that captures Heinrici perfectly, though few have seen it. December 1944. His temporary command post, somewhere in the chaos of the Eastern Front. The image shows a sparse room, a single table covered with maps, no decorations, no propaganda posters, no photographs of the Führer. Heinrici sits alone, shoulders hunched, eyes focused on terrain features with absolute concentration. He looks tired, he looks isolated. He looks like a man who has already calculated exactly how the war will end and has committed himself to a different mission, saving as many of his soldiers as possible before the inevitable collapse. This was not the image of a Nazi general that either side wanted to preserve. After the war, when researchers began assembling the historical record, Heinrici presented a problem. He had never participated in war crimes. Investigations cleared him of atrocities, Holocaust involvement, or illegal orders. He had served the Nazi regime, yes, but his service was marked by technical competence rather than ideological commitment. He had disobeyed Hitler repeatedly, yet not in the manner of the July 20th conspirators who tried to assassinate the Führer. His rebellion was quieter, more methodical, a refusal here, a tactical withdrawal there, always with the justification that he was saving German lives. This made him difficult to categorize. He wasn't a hero who resisted evil. He wasn't a villain who embraced it. He was something more complicated. A professional soldier whose expertise happened to align with humanitarian outcomes, even while serving a genocidal regime. The invisibility deepened in the decades after his death. Heinrici passed away in 1971 in Karlsruhe, West Germany. His funeral was small, attended by a few family members and a handful of veterans. No military honours, no press coverage. No public acknowledgement that one of the 20th century's most effective defensive commanders had died. Meanwhile, military academies around the world began teaching his methods without attribution. The U.S. Army Command and General Staff College analysed the Silo Heights battle. British staff colleges studied his elastic defence doctrine. Soviet military theorists dissected his intelligence methods. His techniques spread through professional military education, disconnected from his name, absorbed into the anonymous body of tactical knowledge. Today, standing at Silo Heights with that tour group, you can visit a museum dedicated to the battle. It's comprehensive, filled with artifacts, maps, and personal stories. Soviet heroism receives detailed documentation. The overwhelming numbers are explained clearly. 1.5 million Soviet troops, 6,000 tanks, 40,000 artillery pieces. The German defence is acknowledged but presented as a brief delay, a speed bump on the road to inevitable victory. Gotthard Heinrici's name appears once, in small text on a single plaque. No photograph accompanies it. No explanation of his methods or their significance. The invisible general remains invisible, which raises the question that will drive this entire story. Why? Why would the Wehrmacht's most effective defensive commander be deliberately forgotten? What did his success reveal that was too uncomfortable for either side to acknowledge? And what can we learn from a general whose greatest achievement was not winning battles, but keeping his soldiers alive long enough to surrender? August 19th, 1914, the forests of East Prussia. Second Lieutenant Gotthard Heinrici, 23 years old and fresh from officer training, crouches in a hastily dug trench near the town of Gumbinnen. The sound reaches him first. A low rumble that builds to thunder as thousands of Russian infantry emerge from the tree line 700 meters away. They advance in dense columns, parade ground formations that seem to ignore the reality of modern firepower. Heinrici's battalion opens up with Maxim machine guns, and the Russian front ranks disintegrate. But more keep coming. Always more. For 3 hours the waves continue, And when the attack finally breaks, Heinrici walks forward to examine the field. Bodies lie in neat rows, testament to disciplined courage meeting industrial killing power. He makes his first notation in what will become a lifelong habit. Enemy commanders value willpower over tactics, numerical superiority over maneuver. It's a lesson that will define everything that follows. The Eastern Front of World War I was a laboratory of defensive warfare, and Heinrici was an eager student. Unlike the Western Front's static trench lines, the East demanded mobility. The frontage was too vast, the forces too dispersed, the terrain too varied for continuous fortifications. German armies faced Russian forces that outnumbered them 2-1 in infantry, 3-1 in artillery shells, but often lacked the coordination and communications to exploit their advantage. Young officers like Heinrici watched their superiors develop new methods: defense in depth, elastic withdrawal, mobile reserves. These weren't theoretical exercises. They were survival mechanisms developed under the pressure of facing an enemy who could afford to spend lives profligately while Germany could not. The Battle of Tannenberg in late August 1914 provided Heinrici's first glimpse of defensive genius. He was attached to the 8th Army when Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff orchestrated one of history's great encirclements. The Russian Second Army, numbering nearly 150,000 men, pushed deep into East Prussia. Rather than meeting them with linear defense, the Germans used interior lines and rail mobility to concentrate forces on the Russian flanks. Heinrici witnessed the results: 92,000 Russians captured, 50,000 casualties, an entire army destroyed. But what struck him most was the intelligence preparation. The Germans had intercepted Russian radio communications, decoded their orders, knew exactly where each corps would move. Information, he realized, could be as decisive as artillery. Winter 1916 brought his first independent command and his first chance to implement defensive theories. His company held a sector near Lake Narosh, facing the Russian offensive that preceded the more famous Brusilov attacks. The Russian preparation was thorough: 3 days of artillery bombardment, then infantry assaults by the Second Army. Heinrici's company numbered 180 men, holding a frontage of 800 meters. Traditional doctrine said hold the front trench at all costs, absorb the bombardment, repel the assault. Heinrici tried something different. He pulled his main force back to a second position, leaving only observers in the front trench. When the bombardment came, it obliterated empty positions. When the Russian infantry advanced, they found no resistance until reaching the second line, where they were caught in prepared kill zones at close range. The attack collapsed with heavy losses. Heinrici's casualties, 23 men. The lesson crystallized over the next 2 years. Elastic defense worked, but only if commanders were willing to abandon the psychological attachment to terrain. In March 1916, facing the Brusilov offensive proper, Heinrici's battalion executed calculated withdrawals that saved it from encirclement. Other units, ordered to hold their ground fanatically, were overrun and destroyed. By 1917, Heinrici had developed a system, established 3 defensive lines separated by 2 to 3 kilometers. Staff the front line thinly with observers and machine gun teams, position the main force in the second line with reserves in the third. When the enemy attacked, the front line would delay, identify the main thrust, then withdraw through prepared routes. The second line would engage the now disrupted enemy, while reserves counterattack to restore original positions. Space was traded for time was used to kill enemies efficiently, and German casualties remained manageable. His mentor during this period was General Otto von Below, one of the Imperial Army's most innovative defensive thinkers. Below commanded various armies on the Eastern Front and later distinguished himself stopping the Italian breakthrough at Caporetto. He recognized Heinrici's talent and encouraged his systematic approach to defensive warfare. War is mathematics, Below told him during a staff meeting in 1917. Every attack costs. Every defense costs. The commander who understands these costs and minimizes his own while maximizing the enemy's will prevail. Heinrici took this to heart. He began keeping detailed notebooks, casualty ratios, ammunition expenditure rates, time required to prepare positions, optimal depth for defensive zones. He turned warfare into quantifiable problems with measurable solutions. The German defensive masterpiece came in 1917 with the creation of the Siegfried Line, known to the Allies as the Hindenburg Line. Heinrici studied its construction obsessively. The position demonstrated defense in-depth principles on a massive scale: an outpost zone, a main battle zone, and a rear zone, each separated by sufficient distance to force attackers to regroup under fire. Concrete bunkers provided protection from artillery while maintaining fields of fire. Reverse slopes hid defenders from direct observation. The entire system assumed attackers would break through the outpost zone, so that zone was expendable. What mattered was channeling the breakthrough into kill zones where German artillery had pre-registered firing coordinates. When the British attacked the Hindenburg Line in April 1917, they advanced 11 kilometres in 6 weeks and suffered nearly 160,000 casualties. The Germans fell back to prepared positions and held, but Heinrici also witnessed the failure of rigid defence. In 1918, as the tide turned decisively, German commanders who refused to implement elastic withdrawal watched their units disintegrate. The spring offensive, Ludendorff's desperate gamble, initially succeeded precisely because it used infiltration tactics and bypassed strongpoints rather than assaulting them directly. When Allied counter-offensives came in summer and autumn, German defenders ordered to hold linear positions were simply overwhelmed. Heinrici's units survived because he maintained mobility, kept reserves available, and withdrew before encirclement could develop. By November 1918, when the armistice came, his regiment was intact, while neighbouring formations had ceased to exist as coherent units. The war ended with Heinrici holding the rank of captain and wearing the Iron Cross First Class. His citation read, "Demonstrated exceptional skill in defensive operations, maintaining unit cohesion through tactical flexibility and thorough preparation. More importantly, he had filled 12 notebooks with observations about defensive warfare. He had learned that intelligence about enemy intentions mattered more than fortifications. He had learned that preserving combat power through calculated withdrawal was more valuable than holding symbolically important terrain. He had learned that defenders who allowed themselves to be fixed in position would be destroyed, while those who maintained the initiative through controlled manoeuvre could survive against superior numbers. Most importantly, he had learned that these lessons were politically uncomfortable because they required admitting that defence was sometimes necessary, that not every position could or should be held, that survival sometimes demanded retreat. The transformation was complete. Gotthard Heinrici had entered the war as a conventional cavalry officer, trained in offensive doctrine and the warrior ethos of the Imperial German Army. He emerged as something new, a defensive theorist who understood that the side that managed casualties most efficiently would prevail in industrial warfare. But Germany was entering a period where such lessons would be unwelcome. The Weimar Republic's military leadership, humiliated by defeat and restricted by the Versailles Treaty to a tiny army, would focus on mobility and offensive operations. The Nazi regime that followed would worship aggression and view defence as defeatism. Heinrici's hard-won expertise would be systematically marginalised for the next 2 decades, a dangerous luxury that Germany could ill afford but refused to embrace. The seeds of his future isolation were planted in the very experiences that made him invaluable. The lecture hall at the Kriegsakademie in Berlin is half empty. It's a Tuesday morning in March 1925, and Major Gotthard Heinrici stands at the chalkboard, drawing diagrams that most of his audience finds profoundly unsettling. To his left, he sketches the traditional defensive model, a solid line representing the front, arrows showing enemy attacks, and a defender either holding or being overrun. To his right, he draws something different. 3 parallel wavy lines with spaces between them. Arrows penetrating the first line, only to be absorbed by the second, counterattack arrows flowing from the third. This, he says, tapping the traditional diagram, is how we think defense should work. He pauses. This, tapping the elastic model, is how it actually works when we want to survive. The skepticism in the room is palpable. 7 years after Germany's defeat, the military establishment is rebuilding around concepts of mobility and offensive action. The Versailles Treaty has limited Germany to 100,000 troops, making every soldier precious, and the idea of trading space for time seem like defeatism. Heinrici's audience includes future generals who will command armies in the next war, but right now they're captains and majors steeped in the offensive tradition of Prussian military culture. One raises his hand. Major Heinrici, doesn't your system assume we'll always be outnumbered and on the defensive? Isn't that planning for defeat? The question hangs in the air, exposing the fundamental tension between military reality and institutional psychology. Heinrici's response is characteristically blunt. Yes, it assumes we might be outnumbered. History suggests this is not an unreasonable assumption. He gestures to a map of Europe on the wall. France has a larger population than Germany. Russia's population is 3 times ours. If we fight them, simultaneously, we will face numerical inferiority. The question is not whether we should prepare for defence, but whether we should prepare for effective defence or ineffective defence. He returns to the chalkboard and begins annotating the elastic defence diagram with numbers. Time to prepare positions. Casualty ratios at different defensive depths, artillery ammunition expenditure rates. He's transforming philosophical debate into quantifiable analysis, and the room gradually quiets as the mathematics becomes compelling. The core of Heinrici's philosophy rests on 3 interconnected principles, each revolutionary in its own way. First, intelligence dominance. Most commanders treated intelligence as supplementary information, useful but not essential. Heinrici argued it was foundational. Know where the enemy will attack, know which units will conduct the assault. Know their morale, their supply situation, their commander's tendencies. This required systematic prisoner, interrogation, signals intelligence, reconnaissance in force, pattern analysis. It meant dedicating resources to information gathering that other commanders would spend on additional defensive positions. But the payoff was enormous. Defenders, with advance warning, could position forces precisely where needed, rather than spreading them uniformly across the entire front. Second principle, elastic depth. The conventional defensive model placed maximum strength at the point of contact, reasoning that preventing enemy breakthrough was paramount. Heinrici flipped this logic. Assume breakthrough will occur somewhere. The front line's job isn't to prevent penetration, but to delay it, identify the main thrust, and channel it into prepared kill zones. This meant accepting that enemy forces would occupy forward positions, which required psychological resilience from both commanders and troops. Soldiers had to be trained to withdraw without panicking, to understand that giving ground was part of the plan. Officers had to resist the natural instinct to commit reserves immediately, instead waiting for the enemy to advance into vulnerable positions. The system required discipline and trust that ran counter to traditional military virtues of holding ground at all costs. The third principle was the most controversial: calculated withdrawal. Heinrici argued that preserving combat power mattered more than holding terrain. Better to defend 10 kilometres with 3 fresh divisions than 5 kilometres with 5 exhausted ones. This sounds obvious in abstract, but implementation required defying orders, abandoning positions that higher headquarters deemed symbolically important, and accepting criticism for defeatism. It meant constantly calculating the mathematics of attrition. At what point does holding a position cost more in casualties than the position is worth? When should forces withdraw to better terrain, even if that terrain is 30 kilometres back? These questions had no ideological answers, only mathematical ones, which made them dangerous in a military culture, increasingly influenced by Nazi concepts of willpower overcoming material disadvantage. Heinrici published these ideas in a series of articles in the Militärwochenblatt, the military's primary professional journal, throughout the late 1920s and early 30s. His writing was dry, technical, filled with tables and diagrams. It reached perhaps 50,000 readers, almost entirely professional officers. The response was muted. Some found his analysis compelling but politically impossible to implement. Others viewed it as defeatist, thinking that undermined the offensive spirit necessary for victory. A few, like Erich von Manstein and Wilhelm Keitel, took notes and quietly integrated some concepts into their own operational planning. But the institutional momentum was moving in the opposite direction. The contrast with Heinz Guderian's concurrent work on armoured warfare illuminates the problem perfectly. Guderian was also publishing prolifically, arguing for concentrated panzer formations and combined arms blitzkrieg tactics. His ideas were equally revolutionary, but they aligned with institutional preferences. They promised offensive victories, dramatic breakthroughs, and quick, decisive campaigns. They fit the German military's self-image as an aggressive, innovative force that would overcome numerical disadvantage through superior tactics. Guderian became a celebrated theorist. His book Achtung, Panzer was widely read and discussed. By contrast, Heinrici's defensive analyses were filed away, acknowledged as competent but uninspiring. The political dimension became unavoidable after 1933, when the Nazi Party took power. Hitler's ideology viewed retreat as weakness and defence as evidence of insufficient will. The entire Nazi worldview rested on aggressive action, on the triumph of spirit over material reality, on fanatic determination forcing victory against any odds. Heinrici's cold mathematics directly contradicted this. His arguments that 5 divisions defending flexibly could outlast 10 divisions attacking frontally implied that German willpower wasn't infinitely powerful. His insistence that calculated retreat could save lives implied that holding symbolically important positions might not be worth the cost. These were heretical thoughts in Hitler's Germany. Heinrici's lecture at the Kriegsakademie ends with a question from the back row. A young captain, clearly uncomfortable, asks the obvious question. Major, if we implement your system, aren't we planning to lose? Aren't we accepting that Germany will always be on the defensive? Heinrici pauses, considering his answer carefully. No, he finally says. We're accepting that Germany might sometimes need to defend, and when that moment comes, we should defend intelligently rather than stupidly. The general who never considers defense is like the boxer who only practices attack. He looks impressive until someone hits him, and then he doesn't know what to do. It's a pragmatic answer, mathematically sound, militarily sensible. It's also completely out of step with where Germany is heading. As the students file out, a few approach Heinrici privately to discuss the concepts further. They see the value in his approach, even if saying so publicly is dangerous. Over the next decade, some will remember these lessons. When the tide turns against Germany on the Eastern Front, when the Wehrmacht finds itself perpetually outnumbered and on the defensive, Heinrici's theories will suddenly seem prophetic. But by then, implementing them will require defying direct orders from the Führer, risking court-martial and execution, choosing between military effectiveness and political survival. The philosophy of elastic defense was brilliant in theory. The question that would haunt Heinrici for the rest of his life was whether it was possible, in practice, whether a general in Hitler's army could actually apply these principles without being relieved, arrested, or shot. The answer would only come when the ultimate test arrived, when Germany was losing, when withdrawal was necessary, and when doing the right thing meant committing career suicide. January 30th, 1933. The Reichstag in Berlin erupts in Nazi salutes as Adolf Hitler takes the oath of office as Chancellor. 200 kilometers east in Königsberg, Colonel Gotthard Heinrici stands with his regiment for the mandatory loyalty ceremony. Around him, officers raise their arms in salute, voices joining in unison for the oath. Heinrici's arm rises mechanically, but his lips barely move. An SS observer in the back of the formation makes a notation in his file. Corps Commander Heinrici, technically compliant, but minimal enthusiasm. Recommend continued observation. It's the beginning of a pattern that will define the next 8 years. Professional competence shadowed by political suspicion, steady advancement undermined by deliberate marginalization. The years between wars are often glossed over in military histories, dismissed as peaceful interludes between the action. For Gotthard Heinrici, they were years of careful navigation through increasingly treacherous political waters. He had emerged from World War I as a respected captain with specialized expertise in defensive operations. The tiny Reichswehr, limited to 100,000 men by Versailles, retained only the best officers. Heinrici made the cut, appointed to staff positions where his analytical skills and systematic approach to military problems proved valuable. By 1925, he was a major teaching at the War Academy. By 1930, a lieutenant colonel commanding an infantry battalion. His efficiency reports were consistently excellent, organized, thorough, tactically brilliant. But they also noted something else: lacks political enthusiasm, insufficient National Socialist commitment, professionally excellent but ideologically questionable. These coded warnings would have destroyed other careers, but Heinrici possessed two advantages that kept him valuable despite his political aloofness. First, his competence was undeniable. Every unit he commanded functioned with clockwork efficiency. Training programs he designed produced measurably better results than standard curricula. His defensive doctrine, while unpopular with Nazi ideologues, was mathematically sound and increasingly relevant as Germany's strategic situation worsened. Second, he cultivated no enemies. He didn't participate in internal military politics, didn't compete for prestigious postings, didn't cultivate relationships with powerful patrons. This made him safe. Not ambitious enough to threaten anyone, not well connected enough to lead a resistance, just a technician who could be utilised where technical skill mattered. The pattern of his assignments tells its own story. 1933. Regimental command in East Prussia, far from Berlin's political centre. 1938. As Austria was annexed, division command in the Anschluss operation, executing the military occupation with flawless logistics but generating no propaganda value. September 1939, as Poland was invaded. His 16th Corps performed textbook operations, securing objectives on schedule with minimal casualties, while Guderian's panzers received the headlines and newsreel coverage. May 1940 in France. Heinrici's corps followed the armoured breakthrough, consolidated gains, and managed occupied territories efficiently while Rommel became an international celebrity for his aggressive tactics. Every assignment was competent, every assignment was secondary. His family life during this period provides insight into his character. His wife, Gertrude, kept a detailed diary that survived the war and reveals a household distinctly uncomfortable with Nazi rule. Her entries from 1935 note conversations, where Heinrici expressed skepticism about Hitler's judgment, concern about Germany's diplomatic isolation, and worry about the regime's racial policies. Gotthard says the party men don't understand military reality, she wrote in October 1936. They think willpower can substitute for supplies, that fanatic belief can overcome numbers. He's very worried about what happens when we face a real war. These private doubts never translated into public resistance, but they made Heinrici cautious. He joined the Nazi Party in 1937, membership essentially mandatory for officers seeking high command, but never joined the SS and never attended party rallies beyond what was absolutely required. The efficiency report from 1940 captures the tension perfectly. His superior, Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, wrote, "General Heinrici is an outstanding tactical commander with comprehensive understanding of combined arms operations. His units consistently achieve objectives with minimal casualties and maximum efficiency. However, he displays insufficient political enthusiasm, and his defensive theories, while technically sound, risk encouraging defeatist thinking among subordinates. Recommended for continued corps command in secondary theatres, but not for army group level leadership. In other words, useful but potentially dangerous, competent but ideologically suspect, someone to keep employed but away from power." June 1941 brought Operation Barbarossa and Heinrici's first major independent command in the war that would define him. His 43rd Corps was assigned to Army Group North, tasked with advancing through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. While the operational plan emphasized speed and breakthrough, Heinrici prepared differently. His pre-invasion intelligence preparation was obsessive. Maps annotated with every reported Soviet unit, defensive positions plotted from aerial reconnaissance, supply requirements calculated to the kilogram. When his staff questioned this level of detail for an invasion expected to collapse Soviet resistance in weeks, Heinrici's response was characteristically pragmatic. Hope for the best. Plan for the worst. The actual advance validated his approach. Guderian's panzers in Army Group Center raced ahead, covering 50 kilometers in the first day and generating triumphant reports about the Red Army's disintegration. Heinrici's infantry corps advanced 18 kilometers, methodically clearing each village and consolidating defensive positions before moving forward. His staff thought him excessively cautious. His soldiers appreciated not being rushed into unsupported positions. By July, as Soviet resistance stiffened and panzer spearheads began encountering organized counterattacks, Heinrici's methodical pace looked less like excessive caution and more like prudent planning. His casualty rates remained consistently lower than neighboring corps, 12% by November 1941 compared to an Army Group North average of 28%. His intelligence work during Barbarossa demonstrated the principles he'd been teaching for 15 years. Every Soviet prisoner was interrogated within hours of capture, not by intelligence specialists alone, but often by Heinrici personally. He wanted to understand not just enemy deployments, but enemy morale, not just unit locations, but command intentions. By September, while other German commanders were surprised by the depth of Soviet reserves, Heinrici had accurately predicted the existence of several reserve armies based on prisoner testimony and captured documents. He warned Army Group headquarters that Leningrad's defences were more extensive than expected, that Soviet resistance would continue through winter, that the entire campaign timeline needed revision. His warnings were noted and ignored. The offensive timetable had been set in Berlin based on ideological assumptions about Slavic inferiority and Soviet political fragility. Reality was not permitted to interfere. December 1941 brought the Soviet winter counteroffensive and vindication of everything Heinrici had been warning about. Along most of the Eastern Front, German units, exhausted from 6 months of continuous combat and unprepared for winter warfare, suffered catastrophic casualties. In Heinrici's sector, losses were manageable. He had rotated units to prevent exhaustion. He had stockpiled winter equipment that other commanders considered unnecessary. He had prepared fallback positions so that when Soviet attacks came, his corps could conduct elastic withdrawals rather than being overrun in exposed positions. By January 1942, while neighbouring corps disintegrated or faced encirclement, 43rd Corps maintained cohesion. This achievement would have profound consequences. The invisible years had prepared Heinrici perfectly for what came next. His political marginalization meant he wasn't psychologically invested in Nazi ideology or Hitler's infallibility. His systematic approach to warfare had created a toolkit of defensive methods ready for immediate application. His low profile meant he could be promoted to crisis commands without triggering power struggles among more politically connected generals. And his reputation for bringing units home alive, for minimizing casualties even in defeat, would matter enormously as the Wehrmacht transitioned from triumphant aggression to desperate survival. The Invisible General was about to become essential, not despite his obscurity, but because of it. Germany didn't need another aggressive panzer leader or ideologically committed Nazi general. It needed someone who could save lives in a losing war. That person was Gotthard Heinrici, and his moment was about to arrive. 3:15 in the morning, June 22nd, 1941, the Lithuanian border dissolves in fire. Along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, 3 million German soldiers surge forward in the largest invasion in human history. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's crusade to destroy the Soviet Union in a single summer campaign, has begun. In the center, Guderian's panzers race toward Minsk. In the south, von Rundstedt's armies drive toward Kiev. And in the north, largely forgotten in the dramatic narratives that will follow, Lieutenant General Gotthard Heinrici's 43rd Corps crosses into Soviet territory with something unusual: a detailed intelligence assessment of every enemy unit they'll encounter in the next 72 hours. The contrast between Heinrici's preparation and the general German approach reveals volumes. Wehrmacht intelligence had systematically underestimated Soviet strength, projecting perhaps 150 Red Army divisions when the actual number exceeded 230. Most German commanders, confident that Soviet resistance would collapse within weeks, treated intelligence preparation as perfunctory. Heinrici treated it as survival. For 3 weeks before Barbarossa's launch, his intelligence staff had collated every piece of information about Soviet dispositions opposite his sector: aerial reconnaissance photos, radio intercept reports, interrogations of border defectors, even analysis of Soviet training exercises observed from German positions. He knew which Soviet divisions held which positions, which commanders led them, even which units had recently received new equipment or additional training. The initial advance showcased Heinrici's methodical approach. While panzer groups to the south created dramatic breakthroughs, capturing thousands of prisoners in vast encirclements. 43rd Corps advanced more slowly, but more sustainably. Heinrici's technique involved clearing operations that future military historians would study as models of combined arms tactics. Each village was approached the same way: artillery preparation, reconnaissance in force to identify defensive positions, infantry assault, supported by direct fire from assault guns, immediate consolidation before moving forward. It looked slow compared to blitzkrieg, but it had crucial advantages. Soviet units bypassed by fast-moving panzers, often reformed behind German lines, creating security problems and requiring divisions to be stripped from the advance for rear area duties. Units that Heinrici's corps defeated stayed defeated. By early July, the distinctive character of Heinrici's operations became apparent even to skeptics. His corps advanced roughly two-thirds the distance of mobile formations but held every metre of ground captured. Casualties among his three divisions, the 1st, 21st and 254th Infantry Divisions, totalling about 45,000 men, remained remarkably low, while neighbouring corps reported casualty rates exceeding 25% by late summer. 43rd Corps losses hovered around 10%. This wasn't accident or luck. Heinrici rotated frontline units every 8 to 10 days, preventing the accumulated exhaustion that degraded other formations' combat effectiveness. He stockpiled supplies rather than trusting in captured Soviet resources. He maintained reconnaissance patrols constantly, refusing to be surprised by counterattacks. The intelligence war within Barbarossa rarely receives attention in popular histories, but it defined operational success or failure. In July 1941, Heinrici personally interrogated a Soviet major captured near Pskov. The prisoner, worn down by 3 days of steady questioning, mentioned reserve armies forming beyond the Stalin line. Most German intelligence officers would have dismissed this as prisoner exaggeration or disinformation. Heinrici pushed harder. How many armies? Which commanders? What equipment? The major's answers, cross-referenced with other prisoner statements and radio intercepts, revealed that Soviet mobilization was far more extensive than German planning assumed. Heinrici forwarded a report to Army Group North headquarters. Enemy strategic reserves significantly exceed intelligence estimates. Current advance timeline is unrealistic. Recommend operational pause to consolidate gains before encountering fresh Soviet armies. The response was swift and dismissive. Army Group Commander Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb acknowledged receipt of Heinrici's assessment, but noted that operational planning has been finalised at the highest level and will not be modified based on prisoner statements of questionable reliability. This moment epitomised the fundamental flaw in German strategic thinking. Ideology trumped evidence. Hitler and the High Command had decided that the Soviet Union would collapse within 12 weeks. Information contradicting this timeline was unwelcome. Heinrici filed the exchange in his records and continued his methodical advance, knowing that reality would eventually overtake fantasy, but having done his duty by warning his superiors. September brought the approach to Leningrad, and the first major test of Heinrici's defensive theories. Soviet resistance stiffened dramatically as German forces neared the city. Stalin had declared Leningrad must not fall. Zhukov took personal command of the defence. Heinrici's sector faced increasingly sophisticated Soviet defensive positions: concrete fortifications, prepared artillery zones, extensive minefields. Other German corps launched frontal assaults that produced horrific casualties. The 254th Infantry Division, temporarily attached to a neighbouring corps, lost nearly 40% of its strength in a single week, attempting to storm fortified positions. When it returned to Heinrici's command, he implemented a different approach. Rather than assault the fortifications directly, Heinrici studied them. His engineers crawled close enough at night to map the defensive layout in detail. His artillery observers identified Soviet command posts and ammunition dumps. His intelligence staff tracked which Soviet units held which sectors and noted their rotation schedules. Then, rather than attacking where defences were strongest, he identified the boundary between two Soviet armies, a seam in the defensive system where coordination was inevitably weakest. The assault went there, supported by concentrated artillery fire against a narrow frontage, infantry advancing in small groups rather than waves, exploiting the penetration methodically rather than rushing ahead. The breakthrough succeeded with casualties 1/5 those of neighbouring corps' frontal assaults. It was technically brilliant, tactically sound, and completely contrary to the aggressive spirit that Nazi doctrine celebrated. Winter 1941 brought the crisis that would reshape Heinrici's career. The Soviet counteroffensive launched in December shattered German armies unprepared for winter warfare and exhausted by 6 months of continuous combat. Along most of the Eastern Front, German units retreated in chaos or were encircled and destroyed. In Heinrici's sector, the situation was different. He had prepared fallback positions during the autumn, despite orders to focus all effort on advancing. He had conserved his troops' strength through systematic rotation, giving them resilience when the Soviet onslaught came. He had maintained supply stockpiles that other commanders had consumed in the final, futile pushes toward their objectives. When the counteroffensive hit, 43rd Corps conducted a textbook elastic defense. The Soviet attackers struck Heinrici's outpost line and drove it back, exactly as his doctrine predicted. But as they advanced, they encountered the main defensive line, positioned on terrain Heinrici had selected for its advantages: reverse slopes that protected defenders from direct fire, river lines that channeled attackers into killing zones, forests that negated Soviet numerical superiority. When Soviet commanders committed their reserves to exploit what they thought was a German collapse, Heinrici's reserves counterattacked into their flanks. The result was a stalemate where Soviet forces made modest gains but suffered disproportionate casualties. By January 1942, 43rd Corps remained coherent and combat effective, while much of Army Group North teetered on disintegration. This achievement did not go unnoticed. While politically connected generals faced relief for their failures during the winter crisis, Heinrici received an urgent summons from Wehrmacht High Command. The message was terse: report immediately to assume command of 4th Army. No explanation was provided, but none was needed. 4th Army was dying. Someone needed to save it. The invisible general, with his unfashionable defensive theories and political unreliability, suddenly looked like Germany's last hope. Barbarossa's forgotten flank had produced a commander who understood what most of the Wehrmacht had forgotten, that survival sometimes mattered more than glory, that the army that preserves its strength can fight tomorrow, and that elastic defense, executed properly, could defeat enemies far more numerous and powerful. The question was whether anyone in Hitler's Germany would let him prove it on a larger scale. January 12, 1942. Gotthard Heinrici sits in his corps headquarters near Pskov when the message arrives. Not a routine communication, but an emergency order transmitted through multiple channels simultaneously, the kind of redundancy that signals genuine crisis. Lieutenant General, assume immediate command 4th Army. Proceed to headquarters Rzhev sector without delay. Acknowledge receipt. He reads it twice, then walks to the situation map. 4th Army's positions are marked in red. A vast salient bulging into Soviet territory near Moscow, surrounded on 3 sides by arrows indicating Soviet attacks. His chief of staff, standing beside him, understands immediately. They're giving you a dying army, he says quietly. Heinrici nods. Yes, and they expect me to keep it alive. The situation that awaited Heinrici was arguably the worst crisis faced by any German army group commander in World War II to that point. 4th Army, commanded until days earlier by Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, had been tasked with holding a massive salient around the city of Rzhev, 200 kilometers west of Moscow. The position had strategic value. It threatened Moscow's northern approaches and tied down substantial Soviet forces. But that value came at catastrophic cost. 16 German divisions, most reduced to 30 to 40% of authorized strength, held a perimeter over 400 kilometers long in the depths of Russian winter. Soviet forces, reinvigorated by Stalin's counteroffensive, were attacking from 3 directions simultaneously with numerical superiority exceeding 4-1. Multiple German positions faced imminent encirclement. Supply lines were breaking down. Officers were requesting permission to evacuate before being cut off entirely. Heinrici arrived at 4th Army headquarters on January 15th to find chaos masquerading as order. Staff officers were burning documents in anticipation of evacuation. Division commanders called hourly, requesting permission to withdraw. The operations map showed gaps in the defensive line where entire battalions had simply ceased to exist. Casualties from December alone exceeded 40,000 men, with replacements numbering fewer than 8,000. Artillery ammunition was rationed to 10 shells per gun per day. Winter equipment remained grossly inadequate, with thousands of soldiers suffering frostbite because they lacked proper boots and coats. The previous commander had repeatedly requested permission to withdraw to shorter, more defensible lines. Hitler had refused, issuing his infamous "not one step back" order that forbade retreat under any circumstances. Heinrici's first command conference lasted 6 hours. He assembled every divisional commander who could reach headquarters, spreading maps across tables in the frozen command bunker. "Gentlemen," he began, "we are ordered to hold this position at all costs. I intend to interpret this position flexibly." The room stirred. One general, a committed Nazi appointed for political reliability, objected immediately. "Herr General, the Führer's order is explicit. No withdrawals. Every metre of ground must be defended." Heinrici turned to him slowly. "I'm aware of the order. I'm also aware that dead soldiers defend nothing. We will hold a position. The question is, which position maximizes our combat power while minimizing casualties? I invite you to remain here and explain your interpretation to the Führer when he asks why this army no longer exists." The decision Heinrici made in those first 48 hours would define his command style and relationship with higher authority for the rest of the war. He ordered immediate withdrawal from the most exposed salients, abandoning 15 to 20 kilometers of prestigious terrain to shorten the defensive perimeter by nearly 30%. Units were consolidated, with understrength divisions merged into effective battle groups. The new defensive line followed rivers and forested terrain where Soviet numerical advantages could be negated. Supplies were redistributed from units in secondary positions to those facing the heaviest attacks. Reserve formations were created by pulling battalions from quiet sectors, giving Heinrici mobile forces to plug gaps and counterattack. All of this violated Hitler's explicit orders. All of it was militarily necessary. All of it required Heinrici to bet his career and possibly his life that results would justify disobedience. The timing proved critical. On January 20th, the same day Heinrici completed his withdrawal to the new positions, Soviet forces launched a major offensive aimed at encircling Fourth Army entirely. They attacked where German positions had been, finding them empty. They advanced rapidly, thinking they had triggered German collapse, only to encounter Heinrici's new defensive line positioned on terrain of his choosing. The attacks hit prepared positions with concentrated firepower and failed with heavy losses. Soviet commanders, expecting pursuit of a retreating enemy, instead faced methodical defense in depth. Within 5 days, the offensive momentum stalled. Heinrici's elastic withdrawal had saved an estimated 40,000 casualties compared to projections if Fourth Army had attempted to hold its original positions. But operational success did not translate to political approval. Hitler's headquarters erupted in fury when reports arrived, detailing Fourth Army's unauthorized withdrawal. Heinrici was summoned to explain himself via secure communication to Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the High Command. The conversation, reconstructed from staff notes, revealed the fundamental incompatibility between military pragmatism and Nazi ideology. "You were ordered to hold," Keitel stated. "I am holding," Heinrici responded. "My army is intact and the enemy has been stopped. Had I remained in the previous positions, this army would no longer exist. The Führer's orders are absolute. You do not have authority to modify them based on your judgment. Then the Führer should command this army himself. I will not preside over its pointless destruction." The exchange should have ended Heinrici's career. Generals had been relieved for far less explicit defiance. Several factors saved him. First, his withdrawal had succeeded. Fourth, Army was stable while neighbouring formations remained in crisis. Second, replacing him meant finding another general willing to accept an impossible command, and few were volunteering. Third, his immediate superior, Field Marshal von Kluge, protected him. Kluge was himself a skeptic of Hitler's no-retreat doctrine and recognised that Heinrici's methods were preserving combat power that Germany desperately needed. He deflected Berlin's fury, reframed the withdrawal as tactical adjustment within the framework of overall defensive strategy, and emphasized that Fourth Army was now capable of sustained resistance. Hitler, preoccupied with multiple crises along the entire Eastern Front, reluctantly accepted the situation. The personnel decisions Heinrici made in those early weeks revealed his priorities. He relieved 3 divisional commanders, all senior to him in rank, for what he termed insufficient flexibility. These generals had attempted to implement Hitler's literal orders to defend every position, resulting in unnecessary casualties and tactical failures. Heinrici replaced them with younger officers who understood elastic defense and trusted to execute it. He promoted several captains and majors directly to battalion command, bypassing normal chains of succession because they had demonstrated competence under fire. He created a new staff position, intelligence coordinator, reporting directly to him, ensuring that prisoner interrogation and reconnaissance reports reached his desk within hours. The organisation he built was meritocratic, pragmatic, and entirely focused on survival. By February 1942, Fourth Army had stabilised. The defensive perimeter, though shortened, remained intact. Soviet attacks continued, but achieved no breakthroughs. Casualty rates declined to sustainable levels, roughly 1/3 those of December and January. Soldiers began receiving winter equipment as supply lines to the new positions proved easier to maintain than the previous overextended routes. Morale, which had been catastrophic in early January, recovered as troops realised they were being competently led. Letters home, intercepted by German military censors, showed the change. December letters spoke of despair and imminent death. March letters mentioned our general, Heinrici's system, and the novel experience of fighting under a commander who seemed committed to keeping them alive. The pattern was set. Heinrici had saved Fourth Army by defying orders, and his success made him simultaneously indispensable and suspect. He was too competent to relieve, but too independent to trust. Berlin could neither fire him nor fully support him. He occupied a unique space in the Wehrmacht hierarchy, a general who preserved his command by systematically violating the Führer's directives while producing results that made punishment impossible. This balancing act would define the next 3 years. Every time Heinrici retreated without authorization, every time he prioritized soldiers' lives over ideologically important terrain, every time he chose military effectiveness over political orthodoxy, the tension with higher authority would ratchet upward. But as long as Fourth Army kept fighting when other armies collapsed, as long as his defensive methods worked where rigid defense failed, he would survive. The promotion no one wanted had become the command no one else could execute. Heinrici had found his war, and Germany had found the general it needed but could never fully embrace. March 8, 1942. The Rzhev salient awakens to artillery fire. Not the scattered harassment fire that had become routine, but a systematic bombardment that crescendos over 6 hours, turning forward positions into moonscapes of frozen earth and shattered timber. Then comes the infantry, 16 Soviet divisions, roughly 200,000 men, supported by 3 tank brigades. Operation Kremlin, Marshal Zhukov's attempt to collapse the Rzhev salient and destroy Fourth Army, has begun. In Heinrici's command bunker 20 kilometers behind the front, the reports flow in. Soviet breakthrough in the northern sector, forward positions overrun, gap developing in the line. A lesser commander would panic. Heinrici consults his intelligence map, covered with notations tracking every Soviet unit, and nods slowly. They're coming exactly where we predicted. Execute contingency plan Delta 3. What happened over the next 10 days would become a template studied in military academies decades later. The Soviet assault crashed through Heinrici's outpost zone, lightly held by reconnaissance elements and observer teams. These units withdrew according to plan, falling back through prepared routes to the main defensive line, 5 kilometers behind the original positions. Soviet commanders, seeing this withdrawal, believed they had shattered German resistance and committed their exploitation forces. The tank brigades meant to turn tactical breakthrough into operational collapse. But the tanks advanced into a carefully prepared killing zone. Heinrici's artillery, positioned on reverse slopes and registered to pre-plotted coordinates, opened fire with devastating accuracy. German anti-tank guns, concealed in forest positions, engaged at point-blank range. Within hours, the Soviet tank force was crippled, Infantry support was separated from armor, and the advance had stalled. But Heinrici's system required more than just stopping attacks. On March 10th, as Soviet forces consolidated their limited gains and prepared to resume the offensive, German counterattacks struck from both flanks. These weren't massive formations meant to recapture all lost ground, but precisely calculated spoiling attacks designed to disrupt Soviet preparations and restore German positions to terrain favourable for continued defence. Battalion-sized Kampfgruppen, combined arms teams of infantry, assault guns and engineers, hit Soviet supply columns and command posts. They inflicted casualties disproportionate to their size, then withdrew before Soviet reserves could respond. By March 18th, Operation Kremlin had ground to a halt, having gained 15 kilometres at the cost of nearly 60,000 casualties. Fourth Army casualties, approximately 12,000, most from the initial bombardment that hit thinly held outpost zones. The secret to Heinrici's success lay in what his staff called the intelligence map, a constantly updated display that tracked Soviet units with unprecedented detail. Every prisoner was interrogated within 2 hours of capture by specialized teams trained to extract tactical information. What unit do you belong to? When did you arrive at the front? What are your supply conditions? Is morale high or low? When combined with radio intercepts, aerial reconnaissance, and patrol reports, this created a comprehensive picture of enemy intentions. By late March 1942, Heinrici could predict Soviet attacks with 72 hours notice, allowing him to shift reserves, concentrate artillery, and position anti-tank weapons exactly where needed. This intelligence obsession was expensive in terms of staff resources and time, but it transformed defence from reactive scrambling to proactive positioning. Summer 1942 tested the system again. Soviet commanders, frustrated by their inability to collapse the Rzhev salient, launched a series of offensives aimed at wearing down Fourth Army through sustained attrition. 5 major operations between June and October, each employing multiple armies and hundreds of thousands of troops. Heinrici met each with the same methodology. Absorb the initial assault in expendable forward positions, channel the breakthrough into kill zones covered by artillery and anti-tank fire, launch local counterattacks to restore key terrain, rotate frontline units before exhaustion degraded their effectiveness. The cumulative result was strategic stalemate. Soviet forces made localized gains but never achieved the breakthrough that would destroy Fourth Army or force evacuation of the salient. The innovation that most distinguished Heinrici's approach was what his soldiers called the shuffle. Unlike other German armies, where divisions remained in frontline positions until destroyed or withdrawn for complete reconstitution. Fourth Army rotated units systematically. A division would hold the line for 8 to 10 days, then be relieved by fresh troops and moved to rear areas for rest, refitting, and training. This seemed wasteful to efficiency-minded staff officers who calculated that relief operations consumed resources and created temporary weaknesses during handoffs. But Heinrici had done the mathematics differently. A division at 70% effectiveness could fight indefinitely if regularly rested. A division ground down to 30% effectiveness became a liability requiring rescue. The shuffle prevented cumulative exhaustion from destroying combat capability. November 1942 brought the ultimate validation. Operation Mars, Marshal Zhukov's most ambitious attempt to destroy the Rzhev salient. The offensive was massive in scale, roughly equivalent to the better-known Operation Uranus that encircled Stalingrad simultaneously. 20 armies, over 1 million Soviet troops, attacked 4th Army and 9th Army across a 300-kilometre front. For 3 weeks, the battle raged with intensity matching anything on the Eastern Front. Soviet forces achieved tactical breakthroughs in multiple locations, penetrated up to 40 kilometres in some sectors, threatened to encircle German formations, and yet, when the offensive finally exhausted itself in early December, the salient remained intact. Soviet casualties exceeded 100,000 killed and wounded. German casualties were approximately 40,000, a kill ratio of 2.5 to 1 in favour of the defender. What made this achievement even more remarkable was the simultaneous crisis at Stalingrad. Hitler's attention and German reserves flowed south to attempt relieving 6th Army's encirclement. 4th Army received minimal reinforcements, no additional supplies beyond bare subsistence, and explicit orders that under no circumstances could Rzhev be abandoned. Heinrici fought Operation Mars with what he had, using his elastic defensive system and intelligence-driven positioning to defeat an enemy with overwhelming numerical and material superiority. When Wehrmacht Supreme Command sent observers to study his methods in early 1943, their reports were thorough and complimentary. But the conclusion was telling: General Heinrici's defensive techniques are highly effective but require commanders to exercise independent judgment, occasionally disregard explicit orders regarding holding terrain, and prioritize preservation of forces over symbolic considerations. These requirements are incompatible with current command philosophy emphasizing fanatic defense and absolute obedience to Führer directives. The technical aspects of Heinrici's system were equally innovative. His artillery commanders developed what became known as Heinrici's fire lanes, pre-registered zones that could be engaged within 3 minutes of observers calling for fire. This required enormous preparation. Every potential Soviet approach route was mapped, firing coordinates calculated for different weapon systems, ammunition pre-positioned to ensure sustained fire. The result was that when Soviet attacks came, they immediately encountered artillery fire of an intensity and accuracy that disrupted formations and separated infantry from armour. Similarly, his anti-tank defences were positioned in depth with overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that even if Soviet tanks broke through the first line, they encountered successive defensive belts rather than open ground for exploitation. But perhaps most important was Heinrici's attention to his soldiers' welfare, unusual in an army, increasingly indifferent to individual suffering. Fourth Army received lower rations and fewer supplies than other formations, yet soldiers consistently reported higher morale. Heinrici ensured that what supplies arrived were distributed equitably, that rear echelon staff didn't hoard resources, that wounded received priority evacuation. He personally visited frontline positions regularly, often without announcement, to assess conditions and address problems. When officers complained about his time spent on such matters, his response was characteristically blunt. Soldiers who know their commander cares whether they live or die fight harder than those who don't. This isn't sentimentality. It's calculating that morale is a combat multiplier. By spring 1943, the Rzhev salient had become a laboratory where Heinrici perfected defensive warfare to a level perhaps never matched before or since. Fourth Army had faced 14 major Soviet offensives over 15 months, defeating each without suffering strategic breakthrough. The salient had absorbed attacks by over 100 Soviet divisions, inflicting casualties exceeding 350,000 while suffering approximately 120,000 itself. These numbers represented not just tactical success but operational validation of elastic defense doctrine. Yet the question remained, why wasn't this system adopted across the entire Wehrmacht? Why did other armies continue implementing rigid defense in depth that consistently failed? The answer lay not in military logic, but in political reality. Heinrici's methods worked, but they required admitting that Germany was losing, that retreat was sometimes necessary, that preserving soldiers' lives mattered more than holding symbolically important terrain. These were truths that Hitler's Germany could not admit, even as they became increasingly obvious. The laboratory had produced brilliant results, but laboratories can be closed when their findings are politically inconvenient, and Heinrici was about to learn that competence was no protection against ideology. June 15th, 1942, 600 kilometers east of the Rzhev salient, in a commandeered mansion outside Moscow, Marshal Georgy Zhukov spreads maps across a conference table. Around him sit senior Soviet commanders, fresh from leading the offensives that have repeatedly failed to collapse Fourth Army. The frustration in the room is palpable. Explain to me, Zhukov demands, jabbing a finger at the Rzhev sector, why we achieved breakthroughs against Ninth Army, against 2nd Panzer Army, against every other German formation, but cannot break through here. The answers come haltingly. German positions are stronger, defensive preparations are more thorough, intelligence somehow predicts Soviet attacks, but one colonel, tasked with analysing captured German documents, offers something more specific. Comrade Marshal, the Fourth Army commander, is different. His name is Heinrici. He withdraws when we expect him to hold, counterattacks where we expect him to consolidate, concentrates forces where we plan to attack. He fights as if he can read our orders. What Zhukov and his staff were discovering was that Gotthard Heinrici had become their most effective teacher. Every Soviet offensive against Fourth Army was a tactical failure, but an educational opportunity. Soviet commanders learned, through painful experience, what worked against elastic defense and what didn't. Frontal assaults failed. Heinrici's system absorbed them efficiently, channeling attacks into prepared kill zones where Soviet numerical superiority became a liability as forces congested on narrow frontages. Breakthrough attempts failed. Penetrating the outpost zone meant nothing because the main defensive line was kilometers deeper, positioned on better terrain, waiting with concentrated firepower. Even successful tactical advances often became operational traps as German counterattacks hit the flanks of Soviet penetrations, threatening to cut off forces that had advanced too far. The Soviet response evolved systematically. By August 1942, Red Army field manuals included new sections explicitly addressing German elastic defense techniques. These documents, captured after the war and studied by Western intelligence, showed sophisticated analysis. Soviet theorists recognized that Heinrici's system depended on intelligence about their intentions, so they developed maskirovka, deception operations designed to conceal true attack axes while threatening secondary sectors. They understood his withdrawal tactics relied on mobility, so they experimented with rapid exploitation forces, tank armies that could penetrate faster than defenders could retreat. They learned that his counterattacks came from mobile reserves, so they increased artillery preparation to disrupt German assembly areas and began holding back their own reserves to counter German counterattacks. The education worked both ways. Heinrici's intelligence staff closely monitored Soviet tactical evolution, noting each innovation and developing countermeasures. When Soviet forces began using maskirovka more effectively, Heinrici responded by increasing prisoner interrogations and patrol activity, using tactical intelligence from the front to validate or contradict operational intelligence from higher sources. When Soviet artillery preparations intensified, Fourth Army dispersed its forces more widely during the pre-assault phase, then concentrated rapidly once the main attack axis became clear. The result was an intellectual arms race, two military systems learning from each other through violent competition, each adaptation forcing counter-adaptation in an endless cycle of tactical innovation. January 1943 brought perhaps the clearest example of this dynamic. Soviet forces launched what became known as Operation Ring in the north, attempting to encircle Fourth Army units near Velikie Luki. The operation employed newly developed shock armies, concentrated formations with thousands of artillery pieces and hundreds of tanks designed to overwhelm defensive positions through sheer firepower. Traditional German doctrine would have attempted to hold existing positions, relying on infantry courage and limited armour to absorb the onslaught. Heinrici did something different. Using intelligence from prisoner interrogations that revealed the shock army's assembly areas, he withdrew his frontline forces 36 hours before the Soviet artillery preparation began. The massive bombardment hit empty positions. When Soviet infantry and tanks advanced, they encountered hasty defensive positions on terrain not yet registered by Soviet artillery. The attack stalled, bought time for Heinrici to shift reserves, and ultimately failed to achieve encirclement. But Soviet commanders learned from this too. The next offensive, in March 1943, included elaborate deception plans, with false radio traffic and dummy artillery positions designed to convince German intelligence that attacks would come where Soviet command had no intention of attacking. The actual assault axis remained concealed until hours before the operation began. This time, Heinrici's withdrawal was less perfectly timed. Soviet forces achieved more significant penetrations before encountering main defensive positions. Yet even this partial success validated Heinrici's system. Fourth Army bent but didn't break, absorbed the assault over several days, and conducted local counterattacks that restored critical terrain. The engagement killed perhaps 15,000 Soviet troops while costing Fourth Army 4,000 casualties. It was a tactical Soviet success that remained an operational failure, and Soviet generals recognized they were learning how to win battles, while struggling to achieve breakthrough operations. The bitter irony was that Heinrici's defensive genius was making the Red Army more effective. Each failed offensive taught Soviet commanders lessons they applied elsewhere. The combined arms tactics developed to crack Heinrici's defences worked even better against other German formations that still relied on rigid linear defence. The Maskirovka techniques pioneered against Fourth Army deceived other German intelligence systems that lacked Heinrici's obsessive attention to prisoner interrogation and tactical intelligence. The artillery breakthrough methods, refined through trial and error at Rzhev, would be used to devastating effect in Operation Bagration in summer 1944, destroying Army Group Center. Heinrici was inadvertently training the force that would ultimately defeat Germany. Soviet intelligence services took particular interest in Heinrici himself. NKVD files, declassified decades after the war, show that identifying his location became a priority. Radio traffic analysis was used to locate Fourth Army headquarters. Agent networks in German-occupied territory were tasked with reporting troop movements that might indicate Heinrici's transfer to a new sector. The reasoning was straightforward. Knowing where Heinrici commanded allowed Soviet planners to attack elsewhere. By late 1942, Red Army operations explicitly avoided Fourth Army's sector when possible, preferring to assault neighbouring formations. This created a paradoxical situation, where Heinrici's competence protected his soldiers by making them undesirable targets, while nearby German units faced increased pressure as Soviet forces sought easier breakthrough opportunities. Zhukov himself later acknowledged Heinrici's impact, though grudgingly and only in his memoirs published years after Stalin's death. Writing about the Rzhev operations, Zhukov noted, "The German defence was organised with great skill. Their commander demonstrated thorough understanding of defensive operations and used terrain to maximum advantage. Soviet forces achieved tactical successes, but operational breakthrough remained elusive due to the enemy's systematic withdrawal to prepared positions and timely counterattacks." In the coded language of Soviet military writing, where criticising fellow Soviet commanders was dangerous, this was high praise for an enemy general. Zhukov never mentioned Heinrici by name in public statements during his lifetime, but contemporaries reported that he referred to Fourth Army's commander as the most difficult opponent he faced in the war. The quantitative impact was measurable. Soviet casualties against Fourth Army from January 1942 through March 1943 totaled approximately 350,000 killed, wounded, and missing. German casualties in the same period were roughly 120,000, but the ratio only tells part of the story. Soviet forces gained valuable combat experience, tested new tactics, and refined operational concepts that would later succeed brilliantly. Fourth Army survived, but the Red Army that emerged from the Rzhev battles was vastly more competent than the one that entered them. Heinrici had held his ground while inadvertently creating the instrument of his own eventual defeat. His elastic defence was brilliant tactically, but strategically neutral. It delayed Soviet victory, while ensuring that when victory came, Soviet forces would be skilled enough to exploit it decisively. By spring 1943, the educational process was nearly complete. Soviet commanders had learned to coordinate artillery, armour, and infantry at scales previously unachievable. They had developed deception operations sophisticated enough to occasionally surprise even Heinrici's intelligence apparatus. They had created shock armies capable of concentrated breakthrough operations. Most importantly, they had learned that German defensive positions could be penetrated and that success required overwhelming local superiority at decisive points rather than uniform superiority across entire fronts. These lessons would destroy other German armies in the coming years. Against Heinrici, they would prove just barely sufficient to achieve operational objectives while suffering casualties that made victory expensive. The teacher and students were approaching parity, which meant that when the Red Army finally achieved the material superiority to match its growing tactical sophistication, even Heinrici's genius might not be enough to save his army. The education was almost complete, and graduation was coming. July 10th, 1943. The Wolf's Lair, Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. The conference room is stifling despite the forest shade outside, thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Adolf Hitler stands over a map table, his hands trembling slightly as he points to the Rzhev salient. "This position has symbolic importance for German prestige," he declares, voice rising. "It demonstrates our ability to hold territory regardless of enemy pressure. We will not abandon it." Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commanding Army Group Center, clears his throat carefully. My Führer, General Heinrici, requests permission to withdraw 4th Army 18 kilometers to a position with better terrain and shorter frontage. His analysis suggests this would reduce casualties by 40% while maintaining strategic pressure on Moscow. Hitler's response is immediate and furious. Heinrici again, always requesting to withdraw. Does he not understand that willpower determines victory? That fanatic defense succeeds where cowardly retreat fails? The tension between Hitler and Heinrici had been building for 18 months, fed by each of Heinrici's tactical withdrawals and each subsequent success that made those withdrawals impossible to punish. Hitler's worldview could not accommodate the idea that retreat might sometimes be militarily superior to defense, that preserving combat power mattered more than holding symbolically important terrain. That cold calculation could outperform fanatic determination. Yet Heinrici's record was undeniable. 4th Army had survived 14 major Soviet offensives, inflicted casualties at ratios exceeding 2-1, and maintained operational effectiveness while neighbouring armies disintegrated. This created cognitive dissonance at the highest levels. Heinrici's methods worked, but they embodied everything Nazi ideology rejected. The RSHA, the SS Intelligence Service, had been maintaining files on Heinrici since 1933. The dossier grew thicker with each passing year. Subject demonstrates political unreliability, noted a report from 1940. Minimal participation in party activities. Wife makes inappropriate comments about regime policies, suggesting household lacks proper national sex, socialist commitment. A 1942 entry stated, subject's tactical withdrawals, while temporarily effective, demonstrate defeatist thinking incompatible with Führer's direction that willpower must prevail over material circumstances. By 1943, the file contained dozens of reports from SS liaison officers attached to 4th Army headquarters, documenting each instance where Heinrici had executed withdrawals without explicit authorization or delayed implementing orders he considered tactically unsound. Martin Bormann, Hitler's powerful personal secretary and gatekeeper, flagged Heinrici's name during a July briefing. My Führer, the pattern is clear. This general repeatedly disobeys your orders regarding territorial defense. His requests to withdraw are fundamentally questioning your strategic judgment. Perhaps a more ideologically committed commander would better serve 4th Army. The suggestion was obvious. Relieve Heinrici. Appoint someone who would implement orders without modification. Restore proper command discipline. But Field Marshal Keitel intervened with pragmatic calculation. My Führer, 4th Army, has faced more Soviet attacks than any other formation and remains combat effective. Finding a replacement who can maintain this effectiveness may prove difficult. The exchanges between Heinrici and higher headquarters during this period reveal the fundamental conflict. In September 1943, Hitler issued an explicit order: 4th Army will hold the Rzhev salient. No withdrawals will be authorized under any circumstances. Prestige position must be defended fanatically. Heinrici's response, transmitted through von Kluge, was carefully worded but unmistakable in meaning. 4th Army will maintain maximum resistance in current sector consistent with preservation of combat effectiveness. Request clarification regarding acceptable casualty levels and duration. This stance should be maintained. It was bureaucratic. Defiance. Wrapping disobedience in technical language, asking questions that exposed the impossibility of the order while nominally accepting it. By late September, the standoff approached crisis. Soviet forces launched another major offensive, this time with clear intention of destroying 4th Army, regardless of cost. Heinrici's intelligence network detected the preparation days in advance. Massive troop concentrations, artillery ammunition stockpiled at forward positions, radio traffic indicating multiple armies coordinating for simultaneous attacks. Heinrici requested emergency authorization to withdraw to defensible positions before the offensive began. Higher headquarters, bound by Hitler's absolute prohibition on retreat, denied the request. Heinrici faced a choice that would define his career: obey orders and watch his army be destroyed, or disobey orders and save his soldiers while risking court-martial and execution. He chose a middle path that demonstrated his political sophistication. Heinrici transmitted a message to Army Group Center headquarters stating that 4th Army would execute tactical adjustments to optimize defensive effectiveness beginning at dawn. No mention of withdrawal, no explicit defiance, just bland military terminology that could mean anything. Then he issued orders for a 20-kilometer withdrawal to positions he had been preparing secretly for weeks. When the Soviet offensive crashed forward, it hit empty trenches. When it reached Heinrici's new positions, it encountered prepared defences on terrain selected for maximum defensive advantage. The attack failed with heavy Soviet casualties. 4th Army survived intact. Hitler's response was predictable. He demanded Heinrici's immediate relief and court-martial for disobeying explicit orders. The message from the Wolf's Lair was unambiguous. General Heinrici has demonstrated intolerable insubordination. He will be removed from command and face charges of defeatism and undermining military discipline. But the order never reached implementation. Von Kluge, who had protected Heinrici multiple times, intervened decisively. He contacted Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel directly and made the pragmatic case 4th Army had just defeated another major Soviet offensive. Removing its commander in the aftermath of success would demoralize the troops and signal weakness to the enemy. The withdrawal, while unauthorized, had prevented a disaster. Prosecuting Heinrici would require explaining why a general who saved his army should be punished, while generals who lost theirs faced lesser consequences. The compromise, reached after days of negotiation between field commanders and Hitler's headquarters, satisfied no one but prevented immediate crisis. Heinrici would not be relieved or court-martialed, but he would be transferred. In October 1943, he was assigned to command 1st Panzer Army in Ukraine, ostensibly a promotion, but actually a lateral move, designed to remove him from 4th Army before his next act of creative insubordination. The transfer order was carefully worded to avoid acknowledging the real reason. General Heinrici's defensive expertise is required in another critical sector. It was professional language masking political purge. The pattern had crystallized. Heinrici was too competent to dismiss, but too independent to trust, too successful to punish, but too disobedient to promote, too valuable to lose, but too dangerous to keep in critical commands. Hitler's headquarters had discovered a unique form of career purgatory. Keep moving him to new assignments before his methodical defiance of orders could accumulate into charges requiring formal action. Each transfer came with praise for past accomplishments and urgent justification of why his talents were needed elsewhere. Each transfer was actually removal before the next confrontation between his tactical pragmatism and Hitler's ideological absolutism. As Heinrici prepared to leave 4th Army in late October, his soldiers reacted with unusual emotion for Wehrmacht troops accustomed to command changes. Letters home, intercepted by military censors, expressed genuine distress. "Our general is being transferred," wrote one corporal, "the one who kept us alive when others were being slaughtered. We're getting a new commander who probably believes in fanatic defense and holding ground regardless of cost." Another soldier was more direct. "Heinrici is being punished for being too good at his job. The party men don't like that he saves lives instead of throwing them away for prestige. The censors flagged these letters as evidence of defeatist thinking but took no action. The sentiment was too widespread. And the soldiers weren't wrong. The Führer's suspicion had won, but only partially. Heinrici survived with career intact, transferred rather than destroyed, still available for future commands when crisis demanded his skills. But the price of survival was constant movement, perpetual marginalization, the guarantee that he would never command the armies or army groups where his methods could be implemented systematically. Hitler's Germany had decided it preferred to lose with ideologically correct generals than win with pragmatic ones. Heinrici's crime wasn't military failure, but military success achieved through methods that exposed Nazi ideology as militarily bankrupt. And for that crime, there could be no forgiveness. Only the grudging accommodation of a regime that needed him too much to destroy him, but could never embrace what he represented. The possibility that retreat might be tactical wisdom, that preserving soldiers' lives might matter more than holding terrain, and that cold mathematical competence might achieve more than fanatic ideological commitment. The Führer's suspicion would shadow Heinrici for the rest of the war. ensuring that his greater skills remained underutilized while Germany desperately needed them most. February 26, 1943. Deep inside 4th Army headquarters near Rzhev, Gotthard Heinrici unveils a map that his staff has been preparing in absolute secrecy for 6 weeks. The map shows the massive Rzhev salient, the bulge in German lines that has consumed so much blood and resources for 15 months, marked with coloured lines indicating withdrawal routes, phase lines for sequential retreats, and defensive positions prepared at various distances behind current front lines. "Gentlemen," Heinrici says quietly, "we are going to abandon Rzhev." The silence in the room is profound. Every officer present knows this operation, if it fails, will not just destroy 4th Army but likely result in court-martials for everyone involved. Heinrici continues, "Operation Buffalo will be the largest planned withdrawal on the Eastern Front. We will extract 300,000 men, all our equipment and supplies under Soviet observation, without triggering pursuit or encirclement, and we will complete it within 12 days. The challenge was unprecedented. The Rzhev salient extended roughly 200 kilometers wide and 160 kilometers deep, containing not just 4th Army but portions of 9th Army as well. Total German forces in the salient approached 350,000 men, 300 artillery pieces of all types, and 25,000 vehicles from panzers to supply trucks. Soviet forces surrounded the salient on 3 sides, constantly probing for weaknesses, ready to exploit any German misstep. Previous attempts at large-scale withdrawals on the Eastern Front had resulted in catastrophic losses. The Demiansk pocket, the Kolm encirclement, dozens of smaller disasters where retreating units were caught in transit and destroyed. Heinrici was proposing to extract an entire army group's worth of forces in the midst of winter, across terrain with limited roads, while maintaining the appearance of continued strong defence. The planning consumed 6 weeks of intensive staff work. Heinrici's operations officers created detailed movement schedules for every division, regiment and battalion. Artillery positions were plotted for sequential withdrawal, ensuring that covering fire would be available as infantry units pulled back. Supply depots were inventoried and prioritised. Ammunition and fuel moved first, everything else abandoned if necessary. Deception operations were planned to convince Soviet intelligence that German defences remained strong and fully manned. Radio operators would maintain normal transmission patterns. Artillery would continue harassment fire at usual rates. Patrols would keep probing Soviet lines. The illusion had to be perfect. Soviet commanders must believe nothing had changed until German forces were safely beyond pursuit range. The deception was multi-layered and sophisticated. Heinrici ordered that frontline positions remain fully manned until the last possible moment, meaning the withdrawal would occur in rapid stages rather than gradual thinning of forces. Dummy positions were prepared, complete with fake artillery pieces made from telephone poles and tarpaulins, positioned to simulate continued German presence after actual forces departed. Small detachments were tasked with maintaining activity at abandoned headquarters. Radio transmissions, vehicle movements, even coordinated light discipline at night to suggest normal occupation. These deception teams, composed of volunteers who understood their risk, would remain behind until hours before Soviet forces could reach them, then withdraw rapidly through prepared routes. March 1st, 1943, the operation began. Rear echelon units moved first, supply depots, hospitals, headquarters staff, maintenance facilities. These elements had no combat function at the front but consumed transportation capacity, so evacuating them early created space in the road network for combat units that would withdraw later. Critically, this initial movement occurred entirely at night and followed roads shielded from Soviet observation by forests or terrain features. Soviet aerial reconnaissance detected nothing unusual. Soviet intelligence, focused on preparing their own spring offensive, noticed no changes in German radio traffic or defensive patterns. The first 48 hours of Operation Buffalo were flawlessly invisible. March 3rd brought the first crisis. A Soviet patrol penetrated German lines and discovered trenches evacuated the previous night. The patrol returned with reports that Germans were withdrawing, triggering alert at Soviet headquarters. Marshal Zhukov ordered immediate reconnaissance in force across the entire Rzhev sector to determine if this was localized withdrawal or something larger. Heinrici had anticipated this moment. His contingency plan placed reserve battalions in the abandoned positions, with orders to offer sufficient resistance that Soviet probes would encounter German forces and report continued occupation. The deception worked for 36 crucial hours, buying time for additional German units to withdraw before Soviet command recognized the full scale of the operation. By March 5th, Soviet intelligence had compiled enough reports to understand that major withdrawal was underway. Orders went out for immediate pursuit, attempting to catch German columns in transit and destroy them piecemeal. Soviet mobile units, cavalry and light tanks, pushed forward aggressively, seeking to cut German retreat routes. They encountered rearguard positions that Heinrici had prepared at 5-kilometre intervals along every withdrawal axis. These weren't main defensive lines, but blocking positions. A company of infantry with anti-tank guns and pre-registered artillery support, sufficient to delay Soviet advance for several hours before withdrawing to the next blocking position. The cumulative effect was Soviet pursuit moving at walking pace while German main forces moved at the maximum speed the road network could support. The most critical moment came on March 8th when Soviet forces broke through a rearguard position and advanced rapidly enough to threaten one of the main withdrawal routes. An entire German division, the 254th Infantry, was in transit on that road, with Soviet tanks potentially hours away from interdicting their movement. Heinrici personally directed the response. He diverted assault guns from another sector, established a hasty defensive position astride the Soviet advance route, and held it just long enough for the infantry division to clear the danger zone. The assault gun unit, commanded by a major who had received the Knight's Cross for the action, delayed Soviet tanks for 7 hours before withdrawing with heavy losses. But 254th Division reached safety, and the withdrawal continued on schedule. March 12th marked the final phase. The last German rearguards crossed the Desna River, with combat engineers prepared to demolish every bridge as soon as troops cleared. Soviet forces, frustrated by days of pursuit that never caught significant German forces in the open, launched a final effort to force river crossings and prevent complete German escape. Artillery duels raged along the Desna as German guns provided covering fire for retreating engineers. At multiple crossing points, demolition charges detonated with German soldiers still within danger range, wounded by their own explosives but accepting that risk as necessary to prevent Soviet crossing. By midnight, March 12th, every bridge across the Desna was destroyed, and Fourth Army had established new defensive positions, 150 kilometers west of Rzhev. The casualty accounting revealed the operation's success with brutal clarity. German losses during Operation Buffalo totaled approximately 8,000 killed and wounded, most among rearguard units that bought time for the main forces. This compared to pre-operation estimates that projected 60,000 casualties if withdrawal occurred under Soviet pressure without systematic planning. Equipment losses were minimal. Fewer than 50 artillery pieces abandoned, mostly damaged weapons that couldn't be evacuated, and roughly 300 vehicles destroyed or left behind. Soviet pursuit forces suffered approximately 15,000 casualties, primarily from encountering rearguards and attempting river crossings against prepared defences. The operation had succeeded beyond reasonable expectations. Hitler's headquarters, which had strenuously opposed abandoning Rzhev on prestige grounds, now claimed Operation Buffalo as validation of proper defensive planning. The official Wehrmacht communiqué described it as a successful strategic withdrawal executed according to plan, demonstrating the continued superiority of German arms. No mention that Heinrici had prepared the operation in secret anticipation of eventually receiving authorization, that the withdrawal directly contradicted Hitler's previously stated intention to hold Rzhev indefinitely, or that several generals at Army Group Center had risked their careers authorizing the operation without explicit Führer approval. The results allowed convenient historical revision. What had been forbidden now became clever strategy. What Heinrici had done in defiance of orders now became implementation of wise higher directive. For military historians analysing Operation Buffalo decades later, the achievement was clear. It represented operational art at its finest. Heinrici had solved a problem that destroyed other armies, extracting massive forces from exposed positions without triggering the catastrophic pursuit and encirclement that typically punished retrograde operations. His solution combined deception, detailed planning, systematic preparation of fallback positions, and ruthless prioritization of what mattered versus what could be abandoned. The operation validated every principle of elastic defense: preserve combat power, trade space for time, deceive the enemy about intentions, maintain mobility rather than fixating on terrain. It should have become required study at every military academy, a template for how to conduct operational withdrawals successfully. Instead, Operation Buffalo was quietly forgotten. The German army was committed to offensive operations and ideologically opposed to celebrating withdrawals, even brilliantly executed ones. Post-war Allied analysts focused on German failures rather than successes, and an operation that saved German forces from destruction held little appeal for historians documenting Germany's defeat. Heinrici himself never publicized the achievement, characteristically avoiding self-promotion. The result was that one of the war's finest examples of operational planning vanished from popular military history, remembered only by specialists and the soldiers who lived through it. Those soldiers never forgot. Decades later, veterans of Fourth Army would gather and toast the general who brought us out of Rzhev, recognizing that Heinrici's art of extraction had saved their lives. But the broader military establishment learned nothing, because acknowledging the achievement required, admitting that retreat, properly executed, could be more militarily valuable than fanatic last stands that Nazi ideology celebrated. The lesson was too uncomfortable, so the achievement was erased. October 15th, 1943. Gotthard Heinrici arrives at the headquarters of the Hungarian First Army in the Carpathian Mountains to assume what is euphemistically termed liaison command. The position is deliberately vague. He is advisor to the Hungarian forces, coordinator with German units in the sector, responsible for a backwater region far from the decisive theatres of war. After 18 months commanding Fourth Army in the most contested sector of the Eastern Front, facing repeated Soviet offensives and earning reputation as one of Germany's finest defensive commanders, he has been exiled to a region where nothing strategically significant is happening. The message is unmistakable. Berlin wants him out of important commands before his next confrontation with Hitler's no-retreat ideology triggers the crisis that neither side wants, but both know is inevitable. The pattern would repeat for the next 15 months: competent performance, sector stabilization, then transfer before Heinrici's methodical independence could embarrass higher headquarters again. From Hungarian First Army, he moved to 1st Panzer Army, a formation that was itself being sidelined as German strategic focus shifted to holding key terrain rather than maintaining operational flexibility. Each new assignment came with warm, official language about his expertise being urgently needed elsewhere. Each new assignment placed him further from theatres where elastic defense might actually matter. It was career management through strategic irrelevance, keeping a dangerous general busy in places where his talents couldn't threaten the political order. The greatest tragedy of this period was visible not where Heinrici served, but where he didn't. June 23rd, 1944 brought Operation Bagration, the Soviet offensive that destroyed Army Group Center in the largest single German defeat of the war. 28 divisions, approximately 400,000 men, were encircled and destroyed in 3 weeks. The offensive succeeded through precisely the methods that Heinrici had been warning about and defending against: massive deception operations, overwhelming local superiority at breakthrough points, rapid exploitation that prevented German forces from establishing new defensive lines. Army Group Center's commander, Field Marshal Ernst Busch, had implemented Hitler's fanatic defense directive precisely as ordered: hold positions at all costs, no withdrawals authorized, every metre of ground to be defended to the last man. The result was catastrophic encirclement and the effective destruction of an entire army group. Heinrici watched from Hungary, reading intelligence summaries that detailed the disaster, while knowing that every error being made was one he could have prevented. His defensive doctrine, developed over 3 years and validated through repeated Soviet offensives, addressed exactly the problems destroying Army Group Center. Elastic depth would have prevented the initial breakthrough from becoming operational encirclement. Intelligence obsession would have detected the massive Soviet preparations and identified the actual attack axes despite deception efforts. Calculated withdrawal would have preserved German combat power by retreating before encirclement developed, but Heinrici wasn't there. He was in the Carpathians, managing a sector that wouldn't see major combat for another 6 months. His expertise deliberately wasted while Germany suffered its worst defeat. The personal cost is visible in his wife Gertrude's diary. Her entries from summer 1944 reflect growing despair. Gotthard received news about Army Group Center's destruction, she wrote July 7th. He said nothing for an hour, just sat reading the casualty reports. Finally he spoke. All those lives wasted. I could have saved them. I've never seen him so affected. Another entry from August. He requests transfer to active command and is refused. They tell him his current position is critical, but we both know the truth. They're keeping him away from anywhere his methods might expose the madness of Hitler's no-retreat orders. He's being punished for being right. December 1944 brought the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's final major attack in the West. The operation consumed Germany's last strategic reserves in a desperate gamble to split the Western Allies and force negotiated peace. Heinrici was not consulted in planning, not assigned a command role, not even informed the offensive was coming until days before it launched. This was particularly striking because the operation required precisely the kind of detailed logistics planning and intelligence preparation that Heinrici excelled at. But Hitler's offensive doctrine valued aggressive spirit over systematic preparation, surprise over sustainability, ambitious objectives over realistic assessment. Heinrici represented everything the offensive wasn't: careful, methodical, realistic about Germany's deteriorating situation. The offensive failed within 2 weeks, consuming men and material that Germany could not replace. By January 1945, the Wehrmacht faced strategic crisis on all fronts. Soviet forces preparing massive winter offensive in the east. Western allies recovered from Ardennes setback and preparing to cross the Rhine. German reserves depleted, production capacity collapsing under Allied bombing. The regime that had deliberately sidelined Gotthard Heinrici was about to face its final crisis, and the question was whether anyone would remember that Germany possessed one general whose defensive expertise might delay the inevitable collapse long enough for, what? Hitler's fantasy of miracle weapons? Negotiated settlement? There were no good options remaining, but there were degrees of catastrophe, and preventing absolute catastrophe required the one general that Nazi ideology most despised. A defensive specialist who saved lives through tactical flexibility rather than throwing them away for prestige positions. The year in obscurity had changed Heinrici in subtle ways, visible only to those close to him. His efficiency reports from this period note increasing detachment from political protocols. He stopped attending party functions entirely, not even maintaining the minimal appearances he had previously observed. When SS liaison officers filed complaints about his insufficient National Socialist commitment, Heinrici made no effort to refute them. It was as if he had decided that his career's end was inevitable, that nothing he did politically would matter, so why bother with pretense? This fatalism made him simultaneously more dangerous and more valuable. Dangerous because he had nothing left to lose by defying orders. Valuable because he would do what was militarily necessary regardless of political consequences. Budapest's siege from December 1944 through February 1945 provided a small stage for Heinrici's methods. He commanded a sector outside the city responsible for defensive positions that might prevent complete Soviet encirclement of Hungarian capital. Other commanders in the Budapest sector implemented Hitler's fanatic defense directive, holding positions until overrun, refusing withdrawal, accepting encirclement rather than saving forces through retrograde operations. Heinrici, as usual, interpreted orders flexibly. His sector conducted elastic defense, trading peripheral terrain for maintained combat effectiveness, withdrawing before positions became untenable. The result was his sector remained stable while others collapsed. His units remained combat effective while others were destroyed or captured. But it was a minor sector of a secondary theatre. The demonstration of competent defensive warfare happened where few noticed and fewer cared. Spring 1945 approached with Germany's military situation transitioning from critical to terminal. Soviet forces, having destroyed Army Group Center and driven deep into Poland, prepared final offensive toward Berlin. Western allies crossed the Rhine and advanced into Germany's industrial heartland. The regime that had sidelined Heinrici had run out of time, run out of space, run out of armies. What remained was the question of whether Germany's final battles would be conducted with competence or fanaticism, whether remaining soldiers would be sacrificed pointlessly or given leadership that might save some fraction of them for survival and eventual surrender. That question would force Adolf Hitler, in the final month of his life, to make a choice he had avoided for 3 years. Hand command of critical sector to the general whose methods he despised, but whose competence he could no longer ignore. The invisible years were ending, the reckoning was coming, and Gotthard Heinrici, exiled and marginalized, was about to receive the most impossible command of his career. March 20th, 1945. The Reich Chancellery bunker in Berlin. Gotthard Heinrici descends concrete steps into an underworld of fluorescent lights, stale air, and the peculiar silence that comes from being buried beneath 15 feet of reinforced concrete. He has been summoned from his command in Hungary with no explanation, just an urgent order to report immediately to the Führer. The guards who check his credentials look exhausted, eyes hollow with the knowledge that they're protecting a regime in its final death spiral. Heinrici carries no illusions. He knows exactly what this summons means. Germany has run out of options, and even Adolf Hitler has been forced to acknowledge that ideological purity matters less than competence when Soviet armies stand 70 kilometers from Berlin. The conference room holds perhaps 20 officers, most looking decades older than their actual ages. Adolf Hitler enters, and Heinrici is shocked by the physical deterioration. The man who commanded Europe's largest army is now a trembling figure, left hand shaking uncontrollably, eyes unfocused, except when concentration forces brief clarity. Hitler gestures to a map of the Oder River line, the last natural barrier before Berlin. General Heinrici, he says, voice lacking its former power, "You are appointed commander of Army Group Vistula. You will hold the Oder line and defend Berlin." The words are declarative, but everyone in the room understands they're closer to plea than order. The Führer, who once prohibited retreat, now needs a general who specializes in defense. Heinrici's response will be remembered by everyone present. With what, my Führer? 4 words that cut through the pretense, acknowledging reality that no one else dares speak. Hitler's eyes focus briefly, anger flashing, then fading to something like resignation. You will have the 9th Army and remnants of 3rd Panzer Army. Reinforcements are being organized. Heinrici studies the map, calculating force ratios that make his request inevitable. My Führer, if I am to defend Berlin, I require authority to conduct mobile defense, to withdraw to better positions when tactically necessary. The room freezes. No one asks Hitler for authority to retreat. The trembling in Hitler's hand intensifies. After 30 seconds that feel eternal, he responds, "You will hold Berlin. How you accomplish this is your responsibility." It's not permission, but it's not prohibition either. It's the closest Adolf Hitler can come to admitting that his fanatic defense doctrine has failed. March 22nd, 1945. Heinrici arrives at Army Group Vistula headquarters, expecting to find a functioning military organization. What he discovers is chaos masquerading as command structure. The Army Group consists of 2 armies, the 9th and 3rd Panzer, totaling 9 divisions on paper. In reality, these divisions are burnt-out shells. A full-strength Wehrmacht infantry division should contain roughly 15,000 men. Heinrici's divisions average 6,000 to 7,000, many filled with teenagers from the Hitler Youth or older men from the Volkssturm militia. Equipment is equally dire. His 9 divisions possess perhaps 80 operational tanks, 250 artillery pieces of all calibers, and ammunition sufficient for 3 to 4 days of sustained combat. Across the Oder River, Soviet intelligence indicates 1.5 million troops, 6,000 tanks, and 41,000 artillery pieces preparing for final offensive. The previous Army Group Vistula commander, Heinrich Himmler of all people, had been appointed based on political loyalty rather than military competence. Himmler's command consisted of issuing orders for fanatic resistance while having no understanding of logistics, intelligence, or operational planning. His staff, selected for party reliability, included officers who had never commanded combat units. When Heinrici reviews their operational plans, he finds documents that might charitably be called fantasy, counteroffensive schemes with non-existent divisions, defensive positions requiring materials unavailable in Germany, supply timelines assuming rail networks already destroyed by Allied bombing. he orders it all discarded and begins from zero, assembling a competent staff from officers he's worked with previously, pulling them from other assignments regardless of official authorization. The situation map tells a story of impending catastrophe. The Oder River line runs roughly 60 kilometers east of Berlin from the Baltic coast south through Frankfurt and Der Oder. Soviet forces hold bridgeheads on the western bank at multiple points, positions they've been reinforcing for weeks in preparation for the final push. The key terrain is Silo Heights, a ridge running parallel to the Oder about 8 kilometers west of the river. The heights rise 40 to 60 meters above the surrounding Oderbruch Valley, providing observation and fields of fire that make them critical to any defense. Heinrici studies the terrain obsessively, walking the positions personally despite the risk from Soviet artillery. Within 72 hours of assuming command, he has made his decision. Silo Heights will be the killing ground where Soviet offensive momentum dies. But the mathematics are daunting. To defend the Oder line properly requires forces Heinrici doesn't have. His 9 divisions must cover a front of over 200 kilometers, meaning average density of 1 division per 23 kilometers. Military doctrine suggests 1 division per 5 to 8 kilometers for effective defense. The force ratio is 5 to 1 in infantry, 70 to 1 in tanks, 16 to 1 in artillery, all favoring the Soviets. These numbers don't suggest difficult defense. They suggest impossible defense. Yet Heinrici must try because there is nothing behind him but Berlin, and beyond Berlin, nothing but final collapse. His mission is not victory, which is impossible, but delay. Every day that Soviet forces remain east of Berlin is one more day for Germany to what? Negotiate. Surrender to the west instead of the east? Heinrici doesn't know the strategic endgame, because there isn't one. He's simply buying time with soldiers' lives, hoping that time might somehow matter. March 25th brings Heinrici's first major confrontation with Hitler's headquarters. He submits formal requests to evacuate Berlin's eastern suburbs, withdrawing civilians and non-essential military installations to shorten defensive lines and free troops for critical sectors. The request is denied, with additional directive. All personnel will remain in place to demonstrate Reich's determination to defend capital. Heinrici responds with detailed memorandum explaining that defending suburbs spreads forces too thin to establish effective main line of resistance. Denied again. He requests authorization to position main defensive line on reverse slopes of Silo Heights, standard defensive doctrine that protects troops from direct fire. Denied, with explanation that forward positions have psychological value in demonstrating German willingness to meet enemy. Every professional military recommendation encounters ideological opposition. His intelligence preparations demonstrate unchanged methodology despite changed circumstances. Prisoner interrogations intensify, with Heinrici personally questioning Soviet deserters who crossed the Oder in increasing numbers. These interrogations reveal critical information. Soviet forces plan massive artillery preparation, duration estimated at 3 to 4 hours, designed to obliterate German frontline positions before infantry assault. The attack will come at dawn to maximize shock and minimize defenders' reaction time. Main thrust will be at Silo Heights because the terrain is unavoidable for any drive on Berlin. Heinrici cross-references prisoner statements with aerial reconnaissance photos showing Soviet supply dumps, with radio intercept intelligence tracking unit movements, with analysis of Soviet doctrine and past operations. Every source points to the same conclusion. The offensive will begin in mid-April, will focus on Silo Heights, and will commence with artillery bombardment of unprecedented scale and intensity. This intelligence allows Heinrici to develop the tactical plan that will define his final battle. If Soviet bombardment will hit frontline positions, those positions should be minimally held. The main defensive force will be positioned on the reverse slope of Silo Heights, protected from direct fire and out of range of initial artillery preparation. When Soviet infantry advances, thinking they've destroyed German defenders, they'll climb the heights and encounter fresh forces in prepared positions. It's classic elastic defense applied to final battle of the Eastern Front, but implementing it requires violating Hitler's directive that forward positions be strongly held. Heinrici makes his decision. He will prepare both plans. One that Hitler's headquarters believes he's implementing, another that he'll actually execute when the battle begins. It's a gamble that could result in his immediate relief or court-martial. But the alternative is watching his soldiers die in positions they cannot hold. The personal cost is visible in faced letters. Heinrici writes to his wife during these weeks. "I have been given mission to defend Berlin with forces that cannot accomplish this task," he writes, March 28th. "I will do what I can to delay the enemy and preserve our soldiers' lives. But I have no illusions about the outcome. The war is lost. My duty now is to lose it as slowly as possible and bring as many men home as I can." Another letter. April 2nd. "They have given me the army they should have given me in 1942. Had I commanded these forces then, with proper authority to implement elastic defence, perhaps we could have stabilised the Eastern Front. Now it's too late. I'm organising a last stand, not mounting a defence." April 10th, 1945. Heinrici completes his defensive preparations. Silo Heights has been fortified with every resource available. Trenches, bunkers, weapons, positions dug into the reverse slope where Soviet artillery cannot reach them. His skeleton force of frontline observers is positioned forward, equipped with radios to report Soviet movements and orders to withdraw rapidly when bombardment begins. His main force, 3 divisions totaling perhaps 25,000 men, is positioned on and behind the heights. Artillery is registered to fire on the forward slopes where Soviet infantry will advance. Tank hunter teams are positioned to ambush Soviet armour as it climbs the ridge. It's textbook defence in depth, the culmination of tactical principles Heinrici has developed over 30 years. It will be tested within days against the greatest offensive ever mounted on European soil. The desperate recall had given Heinrici the worst command of his career. Too few troops, too little time, too little support, defending a regime he didn't believe in for a cause already lost. But it had also given him one final chance to demonstrate that defensive genius could matter even in catastrophic circumstances, that good tactics could delay bad strategy, that preserving soldiers' lives retained value even when the war was lost. Whether he could succeed, whether his methods could work against overwhelming Soviet superiority, whether elastic defense could function when there was no space left to trade for time, these questions would be answered at Silo Heights. The invisible general, finally given critical command, was about to fight his masterpiece battle. It would be remembered as Germany's last significant defensive stand, and it would vindicate everything Heinrici had been teaching since 1918. But vindication would come too late to matter strategically, proving only that Germany had possessed the expertise to fight better defensive war, but lacked the political wisdom to use it. April 16th, 1945, 2:57 a.m. Along the Oder River bridgehead, Soviet artillery crews make final preparations. They work in near silence, conserving energy for what comes next. Behind them, extending back 30 kilometers, are artillery parks on a scale never before assembled for single operation. 41,600 artillery pieces, mortars and rocket launchers arrayed wheel to wheel, positioned to concentrate fire on a frontage of approximately 30 kilometers. This is mass on a level that defies comprehension, industrial warfare refined to pure mathematical expression of material superiority. In command bunkers, officers check watches. Scheduled start time, 300 hours, first light of dawn. The objective: obliterate German defences, shatter Army Group Vistula, open the road to Berlin. What they don't know is that Gotthard Heinrici has spent the night implementing his greatest deception. Midnight. Heinrici's headquarters receives final confirmation from prisoner interrogation. The offensive begins at dawn with massive artillery preparation. Heinrici issues his most controversial order of the war. All frontline troops are to withdraw 2 kilometers to secondary positions immediately. The trenches, bunkers, and defensive works that Soviet intelligence has been mapping for weeks will be abandoned. Soldiers are to move in absolute silence, leaving equipment arranged to suggest continued occupation. Small detachments with radios will remain forward as observers, positioned to report the bombardment and then withdraw. Division commanders receive the order with mixture of relief and terror. Relief, because they won't be sitting in trenches when 500,000 shells arrive. Terror, because if this gamble fails, if Soviet forces realise what's happening and adjust their bombardment, The entire defensive plan collapses. 300 hours exactly. The Soviet bombardment begins. For those who witnessed it, the experience defied description. One German soldier later recalled, "The earth became liquid. Solid ground turned to waves like the ocean. You couldn't hear individual explosions, just continuous thunder that went on forever." 1.2 million shells fall in the first 30 minutes, hitting positions that Heinrici emptied 4 hours earlier. Trees disintegrate. Buildings vanish. The landscape is resculpted by high explosives. Soviet doctrine calls this artillery breakthrough, the concept that sufficient firepower can destroy any defense through pure material expenditure. Soviet planners have calculated that the bombardment will kill or disable 70% of German defenders before the first infantry soldier crosses the start line. But as dawn breaks and the bombardment shifts to deeper targets, Soviet assault troops advance into empty positions. The psychological effect is disorienting. They were told to expect moonscape populated by shell-shocked survivors. Instead, they find abandoned trenches, empty bunkers, no resistance. Forward commanders report back. Germans have retreated. Soviet doctrine anticipates this possibility and has answer: rapid exploitation. If the enemy is running, pursue aggressively before they can establish new positions. Orders flow down from Marshal Georgy Zhukov's headquarters: advance immediately, maintain momentum, don't allow Germans to reconsolidate. The First Belarusian Front surges forward. What the advancing Soviets don't yet understand is that they're climbing toward a killing ground. Silo Heights rises before them, 60 meters of elevation gain, over 2 kilometers of forward slope. The gradient is gentle enough that it's not immediately obvious, but every meter they climb brings them deeper into Heinrichi's trap. His artillery observers, positioned on the crest, can see the entire Soviet advance laid out below them. Radio calls bring German artillery fire crashing down on the forward slopes. Heinrici has positioned his guns on reverse slopes where Soviet counter-battery fire cannot reach them, and he's concentrated every available piece on pre-registered zones covering the approach to the heights. Soviet infantry, advancing in dense formations for mutual support, becomes target-rich environment for German gunners. 600 hours. The Soviet advance reaches the base of Silo Heights proper. This is when they encounter Heinrici's main defensive line for the first time. German infantry positions, invisible from below, open fire at 400 meters range. Machine guns sweep pre-plotted lanes. Anti-tank weapons engage Soviet armor attempting to support the infantry assault. The effect is catastrophic. Soviet first wave, expecting minimal resistance from shell-shocked defenders, runs directly into concentrated defensive fire from fresh troops in prepared positions. Casualties mount exponentially. Within 20 minutes, Soviet commanders realize they're not pursuing defeated enemy but assaulting intact defensive system. Marshal Zhukov, monitoring the offensive from his forward headquarters, faces unexpected crisis. His plan assumed that artillery bombardment would destroy German defenses, allowing rapid advance to encircle Berlin within 48 hours. Instead, 6 hours into the offensive, lead elements are still fighting for control of Silo Heights against unexpectedly strong resistance. Worse, Stalin has sent personal representative to observe the operation, reporting directly to Moscow on progress. Zhukov's reputation, built on consistent offensive success, suddenly faces threat from German general he's never personally encountered, but whose methods have frustrated Soviet operations for 3 years. The pressure to succeed, regardless of cost, becomes intense. Zhukov's response demonstrates both the power and limitation of Soviet operational doctrine. He commits reserves immediately, throwing in tank armies that were meant to exploit breakthrough into operational maneuver. If infantry can't overcome German defense, armor will. 3 tank corps, roughly 900 vehicles, advance towards Silo Heights. But the terrain works against them. The approaches funnel tanks into predictable routes where Heinrichi's anti-tank weapons are positioned. Panzerfaust teams, positioned in concealed positions along the slopes, engage Soviet armor at ranges of 50 meters or less. German artillery shifts to anti-tank munitions, airbursts that shower tank columns with fragmentation. By midday, April 16th, dozens of Soviet tanks burn on the slopes of Silo Heights, and the offensive momentum has completely stalled. April 17th. Zhukov orders continuation of frontal assaults despite mounting casualties. Soviet doctrine emphasizes breakthrough at decisive point regardless of cost, and Silo Heights is unavoidable for any advance on Berlin. Wave attacks continue throughout the day. Soviet forces commit additional armies, extending the assault frontage, attempting to find weak points in German defense. Heinrici responds with his characteristic mobility, shifting reserves to threatened sectors, conducting local counterattacks to restore positions, pulling units from quiet sectors to reinforce critical ones. His defenders are heavily outnumbered at operational level but achieve local parity at tactical level through superior positioning and knowledge of terrain. The innovation that most impressed Soviet analysts afterward was Heinrici's use of what his soldiers called fire lanes. Every approach to German positions had been mapped and designated with sector Prochester identifications. Artillery observers could call fire by simply radiating sector codes. Sector Gustav III, infantry in open, brought artillery fire to precise coordinates within 90 seconds. This eliminated the time-consuming process of calling fire missions with map coordinates and adjusting rounds onto target. The system required extensive preparation and perfect coordination between observers and artillery, but it meant that Soviet forces could not mass for assault without immediately receiving concentrated fire. April 18th brings the crisis point. Heinrici's reserves are exhausted. Ammunition stocks are critically low. Soviet forces have suffered appalling casualties, estimated at 33,000 killed and wounded over 3 days, but their superiority in numbers means they can sustain these losses. German casualties are approximately 12,000, remarkable given the disparity in forces, but irreplaceable. More critically, Soviet forces have achieved penetrations on both flanks of Silo Heights, threatening encirclement. Heinrici faces the decision he's made throughout his career, when to withdraw rather than be destroyed, holding symbolically important terrain. He orders preparation for withdrawal to secondary positions closer to Berlin. April 19th. The line finally breaks. Not through Soviet tactical brilliance, but through simple mathematics of attrition. Heinrici's defenders, fighting continuously for 4 days with minimal sleep and declining ammunition, can no longer maintain defensive integrity. Soviet forces break through at Rzhev, north of the main heights position, opening gap that threatens to envelope German defenders. Heinrici personally directs the withdrawal, positioning rearguards to buy time, coordinating retreat routes to prevent chaos, ensuring that units withdraw in order rather than dissolving in panic. The battle for Silo Heights is over. Soviet forces have won. But the victory cost them 3 days of intense combat, 33,000 casualties, and the shattering realization that even dying Wehrmacht could still fight with tactical brilliance. The military assessment of Silo Heights would occupy analysts for decades. Heinrici had faced overwhelming material disadvantage, outmanned 5-1, outgunned 16-1 in artillery, virtually without armour or air support. He had fought force that represented culmination of Soviet operational art, commanded by Marshal, widely considered the war's finest Soviet general. He had defended against offensive employing scale of firepower, unprecedented in military history. And he had delayed that offensive for 3 critical days, inflicting casualties at ratios that favoured the defender despite all material disadvantages. The achievement validated every principle of elastic defence: intelligence-driven positioning, defence in depth, calculated withdrawal, preservation of combat power over holding terrain. But strategic context reveals the tragedy. 3 days' delay meant nothing to war's outcome. By April 19th, Hitler was in his bunker, making increasingly delusional plans with non-existent armies. Western allies were driving into Germany from the west. The Reich was days from final collapse. Heinrici's masterpiece had bought time that served no strategic purpose, demonstrated defensive brilliance that came too late to matter, vindicated tactical doctrine that should have been implemented years earlier. Soldiers who survived the battle would remember it as proof that good leadership could preserve lives even in catastrophic circumstances. Historians would remember it as Wagnerian last stand, technically impressive but strategically irrelevant. Heinrici himself never spoke publicly about Silo Heights, characteristically avoiding self-promotion. When pressed by interviewers in his final years, his only comment was, "We delayed them. That was my mission. We accomplished it. 3 days, 33,000 Soviet casualties." 12,000 German casualties. In the final accounting of World War II's Eastern Front, it was footnote to catastrophe, masterpiece of defensive warfare that arrived exactly when it could no longer prevent anything except quicker ending to lost war. April 22nd, 1945, Gotthard Heinrici sits in his headquarters bunker, studying a map that shows the military situation with brutal clarity. Soviet forces have broken through Silo Heights and are advancing on Berlin from 3 directions. His Ninth Army, positioned south of the city, is being enveloped by Soviet pincer movements designed to cut it off from other German forces. Wehrmacht High Command, still functioning in Hitler's bunker beneath Berlin, transmits new orders via radio. The message is explicit and specific. Ninth Army will execute immediate breakout to the northeast, relieving Berlin's encirclement and re-establishing defensive line. Heinrici reads the order 3 times, then performs calculation that takes approximately 30 seconds. The order is militarily impossible and would result in the death of every soldier under his command. He makes his decision instantly. He will refuse. The situation requires understanding force dispositions and terrain. Ninth Army consists of roughly 200,000 soldiers, organised in shattered divisions and ad hoc battle groups, nearly surrounded by Soviet forces that outnumber them 4-1. They are positioned southeast of Berlin with Soviet armies on 3 sides. Hitler's order requires them to break out. Northeast, fight through Soviet encirclement, reach Berlin's eastern suburbs, and somehow relieve pressure on the capital. Heinrici's staff calculates probable casualties, 70 to 80% in the breakout attempt, with survivors arriving too depleted to affect Berlin's defense. The strategic logic is fantasy, assuming that willpower can overcome material disadvantage, that German forces can accomplish in 1945 what they couldn't accomplish in 1942 when they were far stronger. It's the last desperate spasm of ideology that cost Germany the war. April 23rd. Heinrici composes his response to Wehrmacht High Command. The message is carefully worded but unmistakable in meaning. Ninth Army faces encirclement and destruction if it attempts northeastern breakout as ordered. Request clarification of strategic objective and authorization for alternative operations that preserve combat effectiveness. It's bureaucratic language wrapping direct challenge to Führer directive. The response comes within hours, transmitted from Hitler's bunker, and bearing Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel's signature. The Führer's orders are explicit and final. Ninth Army will execute breakout to northeast immediately. No modifications are authorized. Failure to comply will result in immediate relief of command and court-martial for disobedience. Heinrici assembles his senior staff to present 2 options. Option 1. Obey the order. Watch Ninth Army be destroyed in futile breakout attempt. Maintain personal career and avoid court-martial. Option 2. Refuse the order. Direct Ninth Army to break out west toward American lines. Save perhaps 40 to 50% of troops, but accept immediate relief and probable execution. He polls his staff. Every officer votes for western breakout. Heinrici nods. Then we're unanimous. I will not preside over pointless slaughter. If they want to court-martial me, they can find me with the Ninth Army. The decision Heinrici makes in this moment represents culmination of his entire career philosophy. For 3 decades, he has argued that preserving soldiers' lives matters more than symbolically important terrain, that tactical withdrawal can be strategic wisdom, that cold military calculation should override ideological commitment. He has implemented these principles through creative interpretation of orders, through tactical modifications that bent directives without explicitly breaking them, through political maneuvering that achieved military objectives while providing bureaucratic cover. But April 23rd, 1945 offers no room for creative interpretation. The order is explicit, the disobedience is explicit, there is no middle ground available. April 24th. An SS courier arrives at Heinrici's headquarters carrying sealed orders from Hitler's bunker. The written directive reiterates previous orders with additional warning. General Heinrici is reminded that disobedience of Führer orders constitutes treason punishable by immediate execution. Ninth Army will break out to northeast. Any officer refusing this order will be arrested by SS security detachment and transported to Berlin for court-martial. The courier, a young Hauptsturmführer who looks barely 20 years old, delivers the message with mechanical precision. Heinrici reads it, signs acknowledgement of receipt, and files it carefully. Then he issues orders for 9th Army to prepare westward breakout toward American positions. The die is cast. The logic of Western breakout is straightforward military calculation, uncontaminated by political fantasy. American forces are advancing from the west and are approximately 60 kilometers from 9th Army positions. Soviet forces encircling 9th Army are concentrated east and south, anticipating northeastern breakout toward Berlin as Hitler's orders specify. Western approach offers thinnest Soviet coverage and shortest distance to friendly lines. More importantly, surrendering to Americans rather than Soviets offers better survival prospects for troops. Soviet treatment of prisoners is harsh. American treatment generally follows Geneva Conventions. Every German soldier knows this calculus. Given choice, they would choose Western surrender over Eastern one. April 25th. Heinrici issues his final orders as Army Group Vistula commander. He directs 9th Army to begin phased withdrawal westward, establishes rearguard positions to cover the movement, and transfers operational control to his deputy. Then he composes letter relieving himself of command, effective immediately. The letter, addressed to Wehrmacht High Command, is masterpiece of military bureaucracy. Due to irreconcilable differences regarding operational planning, I hereby relinquish command of Army Group Vistula. My deputy, General Kurt von Tippelskirch, assumes immediate command. I remain available for reassignment or disciplinary action as higher headquarters deems appropriate. By relieving himself, Heinrici removes Hitler's target while ensuring his operational plan continues. Von Tippelskirch, briefed thoroughly on Heinrici's intentions, implements the westward breakout exactly as designed. The political response is delayed by Berlin's chaos. Hitler's bunker is increasingly cut off from reality, receiving fragmentary reports through failing communication systems, dealing with multiple crises simultaneously as the Reich disintegrates. Heinrici's relief of self is noted, but in final week of Third Reich's existence, command changes occur constantly as officers flee, die, or refuse orders. By the time Hitler's staff focuses on Heinrici's defiance, 9th Army is already in motion westward. Hitler reportedly rages about traitors and cowards, orders Heinrici's arrest, but implementation is impossible. The SS security detachment sent to apprehend him cannot locate his headquarters, which has moved west with retreating army. The court-martial threat remains just threat. The breakout itself demonstrates Heinrici's planning even in absence of his official command. 9th Army moves in phases, establishing defensive perimeters that Soviet forces must assault while main body continues westward. Casualties are heavy, approximately 35,000 killed and wounded, but the breakout succeeds. By early May, between 20,000 and 25,000, 9th Army soldiers reach American lines and surrender. They are exhausted, depleted, defeated, but alive. Had they attempted northeastern breakout toward Berlin as Hitler ordered, virtually none would have survived. Heinrici's final disobedience saved perhaps 50,000 lives, soldiers who went home to families instead of dying for symbolic objective with no strategic value. The personal cost for Heinrici is exile without punishment. He spends final week of war separated from any command, moving west with refugee columns, evading SS patrols that might arrest him, carrying false papers, identifying him as Wehrmacht logistics officer. When Germany surrenders on May 8th, he is near Magdeburg, sleeping in abandoned barn, possessing nothing but uniform, without insignia and packet of personal documents. He surrenders to British forces on May 10th, identifies himself accurately, and waits for either imprisonment or interrogation. The British, sorting through thousands of surrendering German officers, initially don't recognize his name. He's processed as generic German general, interned at facility for high-ranking prisoners, and essentially forgotten in immediate post-war chaos. The final defiance defined Heinrici's character more clearly than any victory. Given choice between career, safety, and soldiers' lives, he chose soldiers. Given choice between ideological obedience and military effectiveness, he chose effectiveness. Given choice between preserving Nazi Germany's symbolic position or preserving German soldiers' actual lives, he chose life. These choices came at personal cost, but they were consistent with everything he had done throughout his career. The Invisible General, fighting his last battle without command or authority, succeeded in his final mission not by defeating enemies but by saving friends. It was an appropriate ending for career, built on defensive warfare, on preserving rather than destroying, on recognizing that sometimes the only victory available is limiting defeat. History would barely notice. Hitler's suicide, Germany's surrender, the revelation of Holocaust horrors, the beginning of Cold War, these events dominated attention in war's final weeks. One German general, refusing orders and saving fraction of his army, rated no headlines, no official acknowledgement, no place in popular narrative of war's ending. But for 25,000 men who reached American lines instead of dying in futile breakout, for their families who received husbands and fathers back instead of death. Notifications. Heinrici's final defiance mattered more than all his tactical brilliance at Rzhev or Silo Heights. He had finally answered the question that shadowed his entire career. Could general in Hitler's army do right thing when right thing contradicted direct orders? Yes. But only at the very end, when regime was too weak to enforce discipline, when doing right thing cost everything but saved lives. The final defiance came too late to change war's outcome, but just in time to demonstrate that even in Wehrmacht, in dying days of genocidal regime, individuals could still choose humanity over ideology. It was small redemption for service to terrible cause, but it was redemption nonetheless. April 28th, 1945. Two men, forever linked by Silo Heights, move in opposite directions through Germany's collapse. Gotthard Heinrici, stripped of command and travelling west in civilian clothes with false papers identifying him as municipal clerk, sleeps in an abandoned schoolhouse near Magdeburg. His uniform is buried in a forest clearing. His general's insignia are at the bottom of the Elbe River. He carries nothing that identifies him as the Wehrmacht general who delayed the Red Army at its moment of triumph. He's become invisible again, deliberately erasing himself from history, even as history reaches its climax. 300 kilometers east in Berlin, Marshal Georgy Zhukov stands in the Reichstag ruins, surrounded by photographers, accepting German surrender documents. He wears every medal he's earned, represents Soviet victory completely, embodies the triumph of communist ideology over fascist aggression. The contrast is perfect. One general erasing himself, one general celebrating himself. They will never meet face to face. May 2nd, 1945. Zhukov's moment of triumph. Soviet flags fly from the Reichstag dome. Photographers capture images that will appear in newspapers worldwide. Soviet soldiers raising the hammer and sickle, Berlin in ruins, Germany defeated absolutely. Zhukov gives interviews to military journalists, describing the final offensive's success, praising Red Army courage and Stalin's brilliant leadership. When journalists ask about the battle for Silo Heights, Zhukov's response is carefully calibrated. The fascist defense was organized competently, but Soviet forces overcame all resistance through superior tactics and revolutionary courage. No mention of Heinrici by name. No acknowledgement that the 3-day delay at Silo represented tactical defeat wrapped in operational victory. The narrative must be uncomplicated triumph, not costly battle against skilled opponent. But privately, in reports to Stalin and in conversations with senior Soviet commanders, Zhukov is less triumphant. Declassified Soviet documents from this period reveal his frustration with Silo Heights casualties. 33,000 Soviet troops killed and wounded in 3 days represents failure of planning. The artillery bombardment that hit empty trenches represents intelligence failure. The commitment of tank reserves meant to exploit breakthrough represents tactical rigidity. Stalin's representative reported all of this back to Moscow, and Zhukov knows his reputation has been diminished. He defeated Germany, yes, but at higher cost than necessary, because one German general anticipated Soviet tactics and positioned his defense perfectly. British interrogation facility, May 10, 1945. Heinrici surrenders to British forces near Magdeburg, identifying himself accurately after 4 days evading capture. The British intelligence officers processing surrendering German generals initially don't recognise his name. They ask standard questions. What was your command? What units did you lead? Did you witness war crimes or have knowledge of concentration camps? Heinrici answers methodically, providing details of his commands but emphasising his lack of involvement in Nazi party politics or criminal activities. The interrogators take notes, file him with hundreds of other German officers, and initially assign him to standard prisoner facility. Only later, when intelligence analysts begin compiling lists of Wehrmacht's most effective commanders, does his name emerge as significant. June 1945. A British military intelligence officer, major conducting research on Eastern Front defensive operations, discovers multiple references to General Heinrici in interrogations of other German prisoners. Officers who served under him speak with unusual reverence. "Heinrici kept us alive," one division commander states. "He was the only general who seemed to care more about soldiers than prestige." Another officer, when asked who was Wehrmacht's best defensive commander, answers without hesitation, "Heinrici, no one else close." The British officer requests detailed interrogation of Heinrici, curious about general who commanded critical sector, but remains virtually unknown. The interrogation sessions, conducted over several days in June and July 1945, reveal Heinrici's expertise to Allied intelligence for the first time. British officers, familiar with Eastern Front's broad outlines but lacking detailed tactical knowledge, are impressed by Heinrici's systematic approach. He describes elastic defense principles with mathematical precision, explains intelligence preparation methods with specific examples, details the Rzhev operations with clarity that demonstrates mastery of defensive warfare. The British officers recognise they're interviewing genuine expert in military art that Western allies practiced only sporadically. They request permission to use Heinrici as consultant for post-war military analysis. The request is approved, and Heinrici spends months providing detailed testimony about Eastern Front defensive operations. Zhukov, meanwhile, discovers his victory is complicated politically. Stalin, paranoid about generals who might accumulate too much prestige, begins diminishing Zhukov's role in Germany's defeat. Official Soviet histories emphasize collective victory by Red Army under party leadership rather than individual generals' brilliance. Zhukov finds himself assigned to secondary commands away from Moscow, effectively exiled despite his victories. When he attempts to write memoirs celebrating his campaigns, the manuscript is censored heavily. References to difficult battles are removed. Casualty figures are adjusted downward. The Silo Heights operation is described as flawless execution rather than costly breakthrough against unexpected resistance. Zhukov learns that Soviet system is uninterested in complicated truths, preferring simplified narratives of inevitable victory. 1960s. Both generals write memoirs, though under very different circumstances. Zhukov's memoirs, finally published after Stalin's death, mention Heinrici exactly once in 600 pages. The German defense at Silo was organized by General Heinrici, a competent commander who used terrain advantages effectively. 24 words, acknowledging 3 years of intellectual combat, 14 major battles, the tactical relationship that defined latter Eastern Front defensive operations. It's grudging recognition, minimal acknowledgement that Zhukov's toughest opponent deserves footnote in victory narrative. Heinrici's memoirs, published in limited edition by German Historical Society, provide detailed tactical analysis without personal glorification. His Silo Heights chapter emphasizes his soldiers' courage and Soviet numerical superiority, barely mentioning his own decisions. The contrast reveals character. Zhukov wrote to glorify himself. Heinrici wrote to educate others. The meeting that never occurred haunts military historians. Two masters of operational art, one offensive, one defensive, locked in 3-year struggle for supremacy on Eastern Front. Zhukov adapted Soviet deep operations doctrine to unprecedented scale. Heinrici perfected elastic defense to science. Each forced the other to improve, creating innovation cycle that raised both sides' tactical sophistication. They were perfect opposites. Zhukov aggressive and political. Heinrici defensive and professional. Zhukov comfortable with high casualties if operationally justified. Heinrici obsessed with minimizing losses. Zhukov celebrated internationally. Heinrici virtually unknown. What would conversation between them have revealed? Would Zhukov acknowledge that Heinrici's defense cost him reputation points with Stalin? Would Heinrici admit that Soviet adaptation to his tactics ultimately doomed Germany? The questions remain unanswered because the meeting never happened and neither man sought it. Physical proximity makes the absence more poignant. In final week of April 1945, Heinrici and Zhukov were separated by less than 20 kilometers at Silo Heights. Artillery observers on both sides could see each other's command posts through binoculars. They breathed the same smoke-filled air, heard the same artillery thunder, experienced the same battle from opposite sides, yet they never met, never spoke, never acknowledged each other directly. After war ended, both lived in Germany temporarily, Heinrici in British internment, Zhukov commanding Soviet occupation zone. They could have requested meeting through official channels, neither did. Perhaps professional respect required distance. Perhaps acknowledging skilled opponent was politically dangerous for Zhukov or personally uncomfortable for Heinrici. Or perhaps both recognized that their relationship existed purely through combat, that removing warfare removed the only language they shared. 1974. Zhukov dies in Moscow, age 77, celebrated Soviet hero with state funeral and international recognition. His obituaries appear in major newspapers worldwide, describing him as one of 20th century's greatest generals. Silo Heights is mentioned briefly as triumph of Soviet arms. Gotthard Heinrici, aged 88 and living in quiet retirement in Karlsruhe, reads the obituaries with no recorded comment. 3 years earlier, in 1971, Heinrici had died with minimal public notice. No major newspapers carried his obituary. No state funeral marked his passing. A few veterans attended small ceremony, but the general who delayed Zhukov's triumphant march left this world as invisibly as he fought in it. The final irony is that Silo Heights, the battle that defined both generals' final confrontation, is remembered primarily as Soviet victory with German defense as footnote. Museums commemorate Soviet heroism. Memorials honor Red Army sacrifice. The German general who orchestrated the defense received single plaque with minimal explanation. Visitors learn that Zhukov's offensive succeeded, that Soviet forces captured Berlin, that Germany was defeated. They don't learn that competent defensive general delayed overwhelming offensive for 3 days through tactical brilliance, that elastic defense nearly worked despite impossible odds, that the margin between success and failure was narrower than Soviet propaganda admitted. The meeting that never was has become the battle that's misremembered. Two generals reduced to victor and footnote rather than recognized as tactical equals, who happened to serve opposite sides of history's most destructive war. June 12, 1945. A British interrogation room in occupied Germany. Gotthard Heinrici sits across a plain wooden table from two intelligence officers who have been questioning him for 3 hours about defensive tactics on the Eastern Front. The officers, both experienced in military analysis, recognize they're interviewing someone extraordinary. Unlike many German generals who blame defeat on Hitler's interference or circumstantial bad luck, Heinrici provides dispassionate tactical assessments of his operations, acknowledging both successes and failures with equal clarity. You saved considerable numbers of your soldiers through elastic withdrawal, one British officer observes. In total war against genocidal regime, does this constitute moral achievement or simply efficient management of criminal enterprise? The room falls silent. Heinrici has no ready answer. He's faced artillery, aircraft, and overwhelming enemy numbers, but he's never been asked to defend the moral calculus of his entire career. The question hanging over Heinrici in war's aftermath is complicated by absence of simple categorization. War crimes investigators examine his record thoroughly. They interview soldiers who served under him, study operational orders issued from his headquarters, review treatment of civilians and prisoners in territories he controlled. The findings are clear. No evidence of atrocities, no participation in Holocaust operations, no illegal orders for execution of prisoners or civilians. Heinrici's commands operated within military law as it existed, distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants, treating prisoners according to Geneva Conventions insofar as chaotic Eastern Front conditions permitted. This moral cleanliness should simplify judgment, but it complicates it instead. He's not war criminal, but he served criminal regime, effectively. He's not ideological Nazi, but his competence extended regime's lifespan. He saved German soldiers' lives, but those soldiers were fighting for cause that murdered millions. 1946. Nuremberg trials proceed with prosecutions of senior Nazi leadership. Heinrici is not charged. His junior status and absence of criminal evidence exclude him from major proceedings. But neither is he called as witness. despite British intelligence recommendation that his testimony about Wehrmacht operations would be valuable. The decision to exclude him reflects prosecutors' calculation that Heinrici complicates preferred narrative. Allied case presents Wehrmacht as criminal organisation implementing Hitler's genocidal policies. Heinrici represents inconvenient exception, professional soldier who served competently without committing crimes, who disobeyed Hitler without joining resistance, who preserved life in war of extermination. He fits neither criminal nor hero category, so he's simply ignored. The personal reckoning comes in letters. Heinrici writes during internment. His wife Gertrude saves correspondence that reveals internal struggle. "I served Germany, not Hitler," he writes, August 1946. "I told myself this throughout the war. Now I wonder if distinction exists. Every day I kept army fighting was day regime survived. Every soldier I saved potentially participated in crimes I never witnessed but cannot deny occurred." Another letter, October, same year. British officer asked if I knew about concentration camps. "I didn't visit them, didn't receive reports about them, wasn't involved in their operation. But I knew something terrible was happening to civilians in occupied territories. We all knew, even if we didn't know specifics. I focused on my sector, my soldiers, my tactical problems. Was this professional focus or moral evasion?" Statistical analysis of units under Heinrici's command supports his claim of relative humanity within inhumane context. Survival rates for soldiers serving in 4th Army during 1942 to 1943 were 15 to 20% higher than Wehrmacht average. This represents thousands of lives preserved through tactical competence. Civilian complaints about 4th Army occupation were fewer than for neighbouring armies, documented in captured Soviet records and post-war interviews with survivors. Heinrici's headquarters issued no orders for civilian reprisals, partisan execution, or other war crimes common in German-occupied territories. In quantifiable measures, his commands were less destructive than comparable Wehrmacht formations. But this statistical morality confronts the fundamental crime. Heinrici's effectiveness prolonged war that killed millions. The 3 days he delayed Soviets at Silo Heights, his tactical masterpiece, accomplished nothing strategically except extending Third Reich by 72 hours. The 15 months he held Rzhev salient kept Wehrmacht threatening Moscow, maintaining strategic pressure that forced Stalin to commit resources against Heinrici rather than exploiting elsewhere. Every Soviet casualty his defences inflicted, every German soldier he saved, every tactical success he achieved contributed marginally to regime's continued existence. He never signed deportation order or commanded execution squad, but his competence in military sphere enabled others' crimes in civilian sphere. 1958. Cold War context reshapes interpretation of Wehrmacht careers. West Germany, now allied with Western powers against Soviet Union, begins rehabilitating German military reputation. Former Wehrmacht officers publish memoirs emphasizing Eastern Front as defensive struggle against communist expansion rather than as consequences of Nazi aggression. Heinrici, released from internment in 1948 and living quietly in Karlsruhe, resists this rehabilitation. When contacted by organizations seeking to restore Wehrmacht's honor, he declines participation. "We lost the war because we deserved to lose," he tells one persistent interviewer. "Germany started it, committed atrocities during it, and was properly defeated. I'm not interested in pretending otherwise." American military historians discover Heinrici in late 1950s, conducting research on Eastern Front defensive operations as Cold War heats up and US military seeks lessons about confronting Soviet forces. They interview him extensively about elastic defense, intelligence preparation, mobile reserves, all techniques relevant to NATO defensive planning. Heinrici cooperates professionally but insists on context. These methods preserved German forces in losing war, he emphasizes. Don't mistake tactical effectiveness for strategic wisdom. Germany's strategy was catastrophically flawed. No amount of tactical brilliance could compensate. The Americans find this frustrating. They want technical lessons without moral complications, tactical manuals without strategic judgment. Heinrici refuses to separate them. The moral complexity becomes public in 1964 when German historian publishes first serious biography of Heinrici. The book presents him sympathetically, competent general who opposed Nazi ideology, saved soldiers' lives, demonstrated moral courage by defying Hitler's final orders. Veterans organizations embrace the narrative enthusiastically, celebrating Heinrici as proof that Wehrmacht contained honorable men. But reviewers note uncomfortable omissions. Heinrici served Hitler's regime for 12 years. His defiance came only in final week of war, when regime was collapsing anyway. His moral courage consisted of saving German soldiers while fighting war of extermination against Slavic population that Nazi ideology deemed subhuman. The biography sells modestly and fades quickly, neither condemning nor celebrating its subject adequately. Heinrici himself offers little public comment on these debates. His own memoir, published in limited edition in 1965, focuses almost entirely on tactical and operational matters. He describes battles, explains decisions, analyzes what worked and what failed. Personal reflection is minimal. Moral justification is absent. The closest he comes to defending his service appears in preface. "I was professional soldier in bad cause. This is contradiction I cannot resolve. I did my duty as I understood it, preserving lives entrusted to me." Whether this constitutes adequate moral response to serving criminal regime, I leave to others to judge. The reckoning that history demanded arrived in fragments, rather than comprehensive judgment. War crimes courts didn't prosecute Heinrici but didn't celebrate him either. Military historians studied his tactics but struggled with strategic context. Veterans honoured him while critics questioned whether honour was appropriate. Moral philosophers found him fascinating test case. Can technical competence exist separately from moral purpose? Is there ethical meaning in how you fight if why you fight is indefensible? These questions had no simple answers because Heinrici himself was no simple case. He was neither villain nor hero, but professional soldier who happened to profess for wrong side, whose expertise saved lives while serving death, whose tactical brilliance illuminated moral darkness of his strategic position. The reckoning left him in purgatory of historical judgment, acknowledged as competent, recognized as non-criminal, but forever tainted by service to genocidal regime, regardless of personal conduct within that service. It was perhaps fitting end for Invisible General, neither condemned nor celebrated sufficiently, frozen in moral ambiguity that reflected war's complexity more accurately than simple villain or hero narratives most people preferred. 2023. The United States Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. A lecture hall filled with majors and lieutenant colonels, mid-career officers studying operational art and tactics. The instructor, a colonel with combat experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, clicks through a presentation titled Elastic Defense, Lessons from Operation Mars, 1942. The slides show maps of the Rzhev salient, diagrams of defensive positions in depth, statistics on force ratios and casualty rates. The students take notes on Heinrici's techniques: intelligence-driven positioning, calculated withdrawals, mobile reserves positioned for local counterattacks. The lecture never mentions Heinrici's name. The techniques have become anonymous military knowledge, disconnected from the general who pioneered them. It's perfect invisibility. His methods survive while he's forgotten, exactly as it was during his life. The paradox of Gotthard Heinrici's legacy is that it exists most powerfully where his name appears least. Military academies around the world teach defensive tactics he developed. Sandhurst in Britain analyzes Silo Heights as exemplar of defense against overwhelming force. Frunze Military Academy in Russia studies Rzhev operations as demonstration of effective defensive depth. Israel Defense Forces incorporate elastic defense principles in doctrine for outnumbered defenders. The techniques are studied, taught, incorporated into military doctrine, but attribution is rare. He's become what he always was, the invisible general, whose competence matters more than credit, whose effectiveness exceeds recognition, whose legacy is measured in unnamed application of principles rather than named honours or memorials. Silo Heights battlefield today is Memorial Park, peaceful farmland dotted with monuments to Soviet soldiers who died capturing it. The museum is comprehensive, documenting Soviet offensive with photographs, artifacts, personal testimonies. German defense receives acknowledgement. You can't explain Soviet casualties without admitting Germans fought effectively. But Heinrici's role is minimized to single plaque. The German defense was commanded by General Gotthard Heinrici, who withdrew to this position after abandoning the Oder bridgehead. 24 words for 3 days of combat that killed 33,000 Soviet soldiers and demonstrated defensive genius. Visitors photograph Soviet memorials, read about Zhukov's triumph, and leave without understanding that the battle was closer contest than monuments suggest. Contrast this with Erwin Rommel memorialization. Rommel has museum dedicated to him in Hurlingen, multiple biographies in print, documentary series about his campaigns, popular recognition approaching universal among military history enthusiasts. His tactical innovations in North Africa are taught widely and attributed correctly. His involvement in July 20th plot, his forced suicide, his complex relationship with Nazi regime, all are documented, debated, analysed publicly. Rommel is visible in every sense that Heinrici is not. Yet Rommel never faced forces as overwhelming as those Heinrici confronted, never preserved armies as effectively, never demonstrated sustained tactical excellence across multiple years of continuous combat. The invisibility is structural. Defensive warfare doesn't generate dramatic narratives that offensive breakthroughs create. Preservation of force is less cinematically compelling than destruction of enemy. Elastic withdrawal is harder to celebrate than aggressive advance. The statistical legacy is most compelling. Argument for Heinrici's historical importance. Estimates suggest that soldiers serving under his command from 1942 through 1945 had 15 to 20% higher survival rates than Wehrmacht average. Applied to the approximately 300 to 400,000 troops who served in his various commands, this represents 50,000 to 80,000 lives preserved through superior tactics and leadership. These survivors went home to families, raised children, contributed to post-war German society. Their lives, and the generations that descended from them, are Heinrici's most tangible legacy. He saved them not through miraculous victory but through competent defeat, through losing battles slowly enough that soldiers could survive until surrender rather than dying in fanatic last stands that accomplished nothing. There's a small museum exhibit in Karlsruhe where Heinrici spent his final years, inaugurated in 2010 as part of broader examination of German military history. The exhibit is balanced and honest, acknowledging both his tactical brilliance and his service to criminal regime. It includes his efficiency reports showing tensions with Nazi leadership, excerpts from his tactical writings, photographs of Silo Heights and Rzhev salient, testimony from soldiers who served under him. Visitor numbers are modest, perhaps few thousand annually, mostly serious military history enthusiasts rather than casual tourists. But the exhibit exists, which represents progress from complete obscurity that characterized him during his lifetime and for decades afterward. Academic recognition came slowly, but substantially. The first serious Heinrici biography wasn't published until 2004, 33 years after his death. Since then, several monographs have analysed his career, situating him properly as one of Wehrmacht's most effective commanders. These works struggle with moral questions his service raises, but acknowledge tactical excellence, honestly. Military journals have published articles analysing his operations, usually focusing on specific battles or tactical innovations. Doctoral dissertations have examined his defensive doctrine, comparing it to contemporary Soviet and Allied approaches. He's become a minor figure in specialised military history, acknowledged by experts if unknown to general public. The question that haunts his legacy is whether defensive genius and evil cause deserves celebration. This isn't theoretical abstraction, but practical question about how we remember war. Heinrici saved German soldiers' lives, but those soldiers were fighting for regime, committing genocide. He demonstrated tactical excellence, but excellence in service of bad cause isn't morally neutral. He disobeyed Hitler's suicidal orders, but only at war's very end, when disobedience was safer than earlier resistance would have been. These complexities resist simple judgment, which explains why his reputation remains contested among historians who study him. The soldiers who served under Heinrici had no such ambiguity. Veteran associations kept his memory alive through private gatherings and limited circulation publications. Their testimony is remarkably consistent. Heinrici cared about soldiers' welfare more than glory, prioritised survival over symbolic victories, led with intelligence rather than bluster. "He brought us home" is recurring phrase in veteran memoirs. Simple statement with profound meaning. In war that killed millions, in army-serving genocidal regime, in circumstances offering minimal hope, he executed mission focused on preservation rather than destruction. That mission mattered intensely to men whose lives he saved, even if it barely registers in broader historical consciousness. 2071. Heinrici's death in Karlsruhe attracted minimal public attention. The obituary in local newspaper was 4 paragraphs, noting his military service and defensive expertise, without elaborating. No national newspapers carried notice of his passing. No military historians published remembrances. He died as invisibly as he lived. General whose greatest achievement was keeping subordinates alive while losing war, whose tactical genius prevented catastrophe without achieving victory, whose legacy existed more in techniques taught anonymously than in personal recognition. His funeral was attended by wife, small number of family members, and perhaps 24 veterans who travelled to pay respects. No military honours were rendered, no flags flew at half-staff. He was buried in civilian cemetery with simple gravestone that identified him as Gotthard Heinrici, General, 1886 to 1971. No mention of battles, no listing of decorations, no epitaph beyond name and dates. The final assessment is that Gotthard Heinrici represents military professional competence divorced from political wisdom, tactical excellence, disconnected from strategic judgment, technical mastery applied to fundamentally flawed purpose. He was brilliant defensive general in war that shouldn't have been fought, serving regime that shouldn't have existed, preserving army that was implementing policies that shouldn't have been tolerated. His invisibility reflects historical discomfort with this combination. We don't know how to celebrate someone who did terrible thing well, or more precisely, who did morally neutral thing excellently in service of morally catastrophic cause, but perhaps the invisibility itself is the fitting legacy. Heinrici never sought glory, never promoted himself, never claimed credit beyond what was minimally necessary. He was professional, doing job with maximum competence and minimum fanfare. His techniques survive because they work, not because his name is attached. His methods are taught because they're effective, not because he's celebrated. Military organizations worldwide apply principles he developed without knowing or caring who developed them. That's success, on terms he would recognize. Practical impact, divorced from personal recognition, competence valued over celebrity, substance prioritized over style. In the end, the general who saved lives did so in context that makes saving complicated. He saved German soldiers who might have committed crimes or might have been innocent conscripts. History doesn't distinguish. He saved them in war that killed tens of millions, making any individual preservation simultaneously significant and statistically insignificant. He saved them through tactical excellence that extended war marginally, creating moral ambiguity about whether saving enemy soldiers in bad cause constitutes good or harm. These are questions without definitive answers, which is why Gotthard Heinrici remains suspended in historical judgment, acknowledged as competent, recognised as complex, remembered imperfectly if remembered at all. The invisible general stayed invisible, his greatest legacy being that military professionals still benefit from methods he pioneered, even if they never learn the name of man who created them. It's legacy that suits him perfectly, forgotten personally but influential practically, absent from public consciousness but present in professional doctrine, invisible to history but imprinted on military art. He saved lives, which was his mission. Whether that mission justified service to unjustifiable regime remains question history cannot resolve, leaving Heinrici exactly where he lived his entire career, in shadows, doing essential work, unrecognised by those he served, but respected by those who understood what he accomplished and at what cost.